Six-pack Lapadat. And once again, we got Kedric Kwan from Performance. Big news drop, my friend. Shell Becklin dropping from 74 down to 66. And the news came a little earlier than Evie Corrigan, whom you also help cut down a weight class and totally shake up Sheffield on year one. Now, some people were in my DMs saying, oh man, why didn't they wait on that Shell announcement? But let's be honest, some of these secrets, they leak out. And if you don't get ahead of it, and especially if somebody's cutting from a rather large cut and they notice and they're like, hold on a second, you're going to Sheffield and you're looking more and more jacked, more and more lean. And as we see pictures of Shell, it would be hard not to recognize my man looks like a freaking shorter Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime. It's nuts. He's like a Norwegian version of Russell Orhe right now. So better to get in front of the rumors and announce it and keep all the hype. But Shell, of course, reached out to you, my man, and for this cut, and it's probably a good decision. You pulled this off last time with Evie and won Sheffield with Evie, and it looks poised to possibly do it here. Look at before we get into it, I'll just let everybody know because this could be a long one. We're going to talk about from Shell, the weight cut, Sheffield, to updates on all your Sheffield athletes. You got a bunch of them, a bunch of when cutting, when recomping. We're going to get down to the metabolism, sugars, and how the spiking of sugars from seed oils and processed foods and right down the gut cuts. We'll talk about your supplements. What's the deal on BCAAs, pre-workouts that used to be stronger, now they're weaker. What's taken out? What are you getting from it? Protein, GLP-1, freaking a bunch of stuff. We're going to get into all of it, but first, let's not bury the lead. Let's talk about Shell. What happened here? Did he reach out to you and say, I got a crazy idea? How did this happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because obviously, but first of all, thank you for having me back on the show. Appreciate the invite, and I think we have to take things back, right? Where all of this kind of like started. So Kjell reached out to me at Sheffield 2024 this year. So Kjell was the reserve, right? So he was invited to the reserve after the whole competition was done. When we were in the meet and greet, Kjell was there. And then he said, hey, I want to speak to you about nutrition, right? And then we met up at Sheffield and we were just having a chat. He told me his situation, and I think it's not a secret, so I don't have to like hold it back. Where I mean, Kjell openly has mentioned that his nutrition is absolutely atrocious before starting nutrition coaching. 180 grams of
That
fat,
was it.
easily 4,000 calories.
Sorry, I just cut you off and you give me the answer too. How much was he eating?
I mean, he can like easily consume 3 to 4,000 calories just like that of like just basically junk. Like it's not exaggeration when he said he can just eat like a kilogram of like fries. He can do that actually. So
A kilo
and
of fries?
yeah, like
God bless. He's living his best life, man. I'm not mad at that at all.
yep, yep. And it's funny because when we were having the conversation, Kjell was there with his wife, and his wife just basically said that this is not an exaggeration. Kjell basically eats like a child, but he just eats like the quantities that he consumes are like way more than what a child would, but the food choices are basically the same. Like what his daughter eats, he probably eats the same kind of food, but worse. So that
Play-Doh
was the
and shit.
situation with, yeah, that was kind of like the situation with Kjell, and we reached out. He said like I want to try to optimize my nutrition. He said that I'm already at this age where I've achieved a lot, right? I've done a lot of things. I have a lot of accolades in powerlifting, but nutrition is something that I have never really thought about. And after looking at the success that I had with some of the lifters that I work with, he reached out, and then during that time he also said, this might be a long shot, right? And we'll see how things play out. But there's a chance that I would want to go down to the 66. So that was like the first, like the planting of the seed, right? On
When was this? When was this around?
this was Sheffield, the first Sheffield.
What? He
Sorry,
said
not
this
the
at the
not the
last
first
Sheffield?
Sheffield. The Last Sheffield. The one where Gustav won,
What?
yeah,
So
2024. So
he already was tinkering in the back of his head.
yeah,
Like, I might do this. I might cut the 66.
yeah. So uh and then I said, yeah, let's see how it goes, And I never thought it was I first of all I didn't really think it was impossible. Uh based on his height. I definitely think it was possible, but I don't want to say that we can 100% make it just because I don't know how you are like. And all I know is that you eat a kilo of fries and you eat absolutely atrocious. So I don't really know
Dude,
how.
may I say something? That's one of the most impressive numbers he's got. And he's got some impressive numbers. But a
Yeah,
kilo of fries should be in his bio. That should be in his bio.
one.
That's
Yep,
impressive,
yep,
man. Hats off. He
yeah,
went up a notch in
and
my book. God bless.
yeah. I mean, like I said, his wife said it was not an exaggeration. So it was pretty crazy, right? So we started from there, and then we worked together going into the Arnold, right? Because the Arnold was slightly after Sheffield, right? We didn't really do much there. I just make sure that his weight didn't go too high so that we can make a successful cut and just trial some rehydration, see how he feels with the rehydration protocols. And he felt strong. He felt good. Obviously, he broke the world record at the Arnold's, and then we worked together going into Worlds. Right, at Worlds he totaled 2.5 kilos less. I mean, he missed all of his third attempt, so 2.5 kilos less than the world record. Arguably, he could have beaten his previous PR total if he wasn't trying to push like perk. And post Worlds, we will the conversation of Sheffield has definitely like popped up, especially since Kjell actually won second best lifter at Worlds, right? So there's definitely a hope there. Uh, and when we got the wild card, so like post Worlds, Kjell was like, okay, cool. I'm just gonna have to spend a couple of weeks, right, just to eat and stuff. And naturally, like I said, I don't know how many kilos of fries he ate, and his weight went back up. And what I said was, uh, we are just gonna cut down slightly, right, just to trim up, so that when your training gets harder, if you do like more volume, more hypertrophy work, right, then if your weight is lower, we can still potentially pack on some muscle mass. Obviously, we have to bring your weight down slightly. So we started the weight cutting process a couple of weeks after Worlds, after he got all the fries out of his system, and then as his weights gradually trended down, they SBD told Kjell that he had the wild card, right? And once that news was brought up, we looked at his weight and we said, and then obviously we look at the weight classes that he could potentially be at, right? Whether it's 74 or the 66. And then after through some discussion, he said, let's do the 66. And I said, yep, let's do it, right? Like I said, you came to me, you said that you have a lot of accolades, you have done a lot in powerlifting, and this is something that's going to be new for you, right? First of all, you never had nutrition coaching, your nutrition was atrocious, and now you have to take your nutrition to a whole new level to achieve what you plan to achieve. So I said that itself is a good challenge for someone like you who would be a masters lifter really in the next couple of years, and I think that it is actually a very good way to show the younger lifters out there as well that there are still new things that you can kind of pursue. When people say you're done, you're not really done. That the cliche saying. And I think for Kjell, that like struck a chord with him, and that's how we decided to cut down to the 66.
Well, first off, um, Kjell having those seeds at the last Sheffield. This Sheffield is starting to instigate this. Sheffield is, and it looks like, look, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Kjell's got to do what he's got to do first, but Sheffield has become the event where something wild happens. Evie did it year one, Agatha did it year two, and now Kjell is coming in year three. Like, hey, guess what? Oops, we did it again. And it's exciting because worlds you get those clashes, great. Though in every single weight class you get those clashes, but when it comes, you'll get clashes within a weight class at Sheffield. But when you have someone who instigates throwing powerlifting on its ear, and just when you think we are now in the Austin Perkins era of pound for pound king, Kjell says, "Excuse me, pardon me. but this is going to be the shortest era ever because I'm about to take over the game. And when Kjell does what he's going to do, Kjell at the last Worlds, to your point, was already number 2 pound for pound on the GL points. He was already number 2 best lifter at the World Championships. Bob Matthews and Perk were going back and forth, and Kjell jumped into the comment section and said, "Excuse me, Bob, you won't get by me." Because, he's like, "Don't look past me, please." And that was no disrespect to Bob. It's more, don't forget about me. I got to tighten in my weight class like Perk, and it's casting a bit of a shadow here. Well, guess what? Now he's dropping down to 66. He's the Titan. And I mean, not by a little. Perk had Kjell to keep him honest. Kjell is going to be a monster in 66. The percentage in which he could win or he could break the world record, Perk was in the comment section of that video clip announcing it. And Perk himself said, "Okay, yeah, you won." I'm like, "It's yours." What can we say? It's yours. So it's, and not only that, but with the implications at World Championships, winning best lifter, winning Sheffield. What is on the table for Kjell right now? His 2025 at 36 years old, father. Literally, he's been on the podcast talking about he was so far gone that he was in so much pain, he was bedridden at times. Injuries had him, and he thought, I'm never coming back. I'll do equipment because it keeps my hips in place, etc. But I'm never going to be able to come back to classic. To literally at 36, at the back end of his career, what are we talking about here? He has potential. Now he's got to do it, but this is what gets everyone excited. Potential to shatter Sheffield, take a world title, win best lifter, like have the best year of his life. And he already was a legend. It's going to be really uncomfortable when the GOAT Slayer starts being referred to as the GOAT. That's ironic, huh? That's when irony really comes full circle. Because previously he was the GOAT Slayer because he'd upset GOATs in direct competition and get wins over Taylor Atwood and Oleg and these legends of the game. Now what are we looking at? At Sheffield, everybody's a GOAT these days. At Sheffield, all of these GOATs show up. And the GOAT Slayer's really he's gonna have the Game of Thrones Red Wedding. It's gonna be people are like, this could be a slaughter. And it might be. I don't know. I gotta see it. The proof is in the pudding, though. The proof is in the pudding. So let's stay on this for a hot second. We'll talk about Kjell, and then we'll talk about the implications of the rest of powerlifting due to it. But Kjell dropped some pictures, and I posted it, and he looks absolutely diced. And we're pretty far out. Okay, we're just entering October. That picture was from September. Are you able to reveal his body weight, or what can you say about where he's at on this journey? I think he already said it, actually. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, if like he has openly shared his body weight on his post, right? I think on the days where he, when we tend to have refeeds, which we do have when his training gets slightly tougher, he'll probably wake up around 71.5, around there. I think the lowest we've reached was around like mid to low 70s. So pretty good. I told him that the plan was to hit 70, and then we will see how you feel, how the body is feeling, if you can drop slightly more or not, or should we just decide to cut from 70? So we are ahead of schedule, which is great. I think that trying to carve out some breathing room for lifters is very, very important. You don't want to wait till the last minute to know that you are at weight. I think from a psychological perspective as well, it takes one stressor of your mind. So I would probably say that he's probably like, obviously I don't really know the amount of weight he will lose in the cut, but we'll definitely figure out way beforehand. But I would probably say if we assume that he'll cut from 70, I think we're 2 weeks away from making weight to 66. That's what I would say.
It's funny. That's what some people were saying in the comments. They're like, okay, he's at 70 kilos, but he's still got 4 more kilos to cut. Let's see how he feels after he's cut 4 more kilos. And I'm like, my friends, are you under the impression that he's going to be walking around at 66 kilos? No. He's going to weigh 66 kilos for about half hour that day. That's for maybe a half hour, maybe less, roughly that long. That's how long he's going to be 66 kilos. He's not walking around. He's already at where he needs to be at. If anything, he'll be 69 in a stitch. And if anyone's wondering, like, long time 66, two-time world champion at 66, Penna walks around about 69 kilos. So when people are talking about cutting from certain weights, it's like, no, when he says he's 70, we're already pretty much there. And it was September. So it's not all up in the air. It's not, oh my God, how will he feel? Like that people are thinking. For you guys, yeah, it's on the margins, right? You want to know exactly. But you're 100% right. To be at this point with so many months left to go, so much time left, it's a good position to be in. Because if you need whatever it is you need for any adjustments, and the longer he's at a certain weight and he's getting a little used to it is good too. Because levers change under the bar for squatting and you don't want
100%.
any super surprises or whatever. Adjust. If you got to adjust your deadlift setup, your squat setup, or if you got to adjust anything, maybe you do, maybe you don't, but at least have a little time because it's the first time cutting. If he's been doing this on and off, not always down that body weight, but he's cut several times, 66, no major surprises. But it's good to have some time so there's not surprises. And he's going to be ready, man. And it'll be interesting to see. We had a quick conversation offline, and I told you, hang on, put a pause in that. Wait for when we start recording because that's an interesting conversation. We were talking about the future and this is impacting all these other lifters. And then you said, hey, it's great. What happens if Perk cuts? And I was like, I don't think he's cutting. And then you said, well, he was well underneath 74 at Worlds. It's not that crazy. I don't know. What do you think? Could Perk, is this something that you think might be on the table?
I mean, I don't want to discount the possibility. All right. So I would say that, the chances are slim, but it is there. I do think, Kjell has openly said on the podcast that Perk is something else, right? Those were Kjell's literal words, like Perk is something else. And I think that Perk really has the potential to do crazy things, especially once he really maximized the weight class, the 74 kilo weight class. So I don't really know what Perk's mindset is. We have one extreme where people will always try to cut, right, to going down a weight class to beat the lower world record. But we have the other extreme, for example, like Bob Matthews, who I'm not gonna go to 105 because I want to maximize my potential at 120, and I want to crush whatever 120 holds for me. Therefore, my next meet is PA Nationals. At least that's what he has openly said. How true that is, I'm pretty sure we'll find out in the next couple of months. But there's always that, right? We know for a fact that cutting down would definitely impact your potential, right? To grow. And the difference between Perk and Kjell is Perk is still relatively young. The research shows that most people hit their prime in powerlifting around the age of like 30, right? Early 30s. And Perk's not there yet. Kjell is probably already there, maybe slowly surpassing that peak, right? Therefore it makes more sense for Kjell to cut down. But I just don't want to discount the possibility of it, because there's a lot on the line, right? There's a lot of money on the line. There's glory on the line. That is something that might happen. I would say the chances are slim, but it's possible. So and like I said, my role as the coach for being a part of Kjell's team is to just think of situations that are that could probably play out in the future. So who knows?
Questions as we throw this around, a couple questions I have for you that are interesting to me. First off, yeah, in the comments, someone had said as well, same announcement. We posted it, King of List, Sheffield, and Shell's account collaborated on it. And some people in the comments saying, well, what happens if Perk drops? Well, a couple things here. A, Perk is number one at 74. He just won best lifter as a 74. Shell's the one who's got to make some movement and take it from him. It'd be too early to do that yet. Even though Perk was all right, you won, whatever. In the comments, still Perk's a lion, and he's got more kilos to put on his body weight and his total at 74. So, yeah, I think it'd be early. Second, we don't know what it would look like if he drops because Kjell dropping, they're built not at all the same. Perk and Kjell, they're both 74s. So people just say, well, he's a 74, he's dropping to 66. What if this other 74 drops to 66? Have you seen these guys? They're not the same. You know, they're not built the same. Kjell is a tank, but he's around 5 feet tall. Perk is by no means like a lot taller, but he's taller. Frames are different. The cut on him, the more slender you get, when you're shifting the weight these guys shift, you're begging for trouble. Perk is already really putting his foot on the gas and maxing out his frame. And he's talked about, he's dealt with injuries. You know, he's a young ass man in his mid-20s, some serious injuries that have really set back his career previously, started hitting a stride around, the last year or so, right? And he is what he is. Now he's the king pound for pound. Most people would agree. Kjell is built different, shorter frame, so he could be a stockier frame. So when he drops, he doesn't have to, he's still going to be extremely stocky to be able to handle big loads, which he's going to have to. Be very interesting how heavy he's going to be able to shift, but still. So it's not all the same when people say this. Here's a follow-up for you, though. What if Perk found his way into your DMs and said, hey, I love what you did with Evie. I love what you did with Kjell. Let's say Kjell does amazing. I love what you did with Kjell. Could you help me cut the 66? What do you tell that young man?
Yeah, I have a lot. I mean, I already made up my mind on situations like this. Obviously there are certain circumstances that that I had to deal with. I think the big one was Gustav and Emil, right? Prior was Gustav, Emil, Gavin as well, right? All three of them. I mean, Gustav and Gavin. There was never Gustav, Emil, and Gavin all three together on the platform. When I was coaching them, because Gavin and I stopped working together. After Sheffield, which and obviously Gavin didn't go to Worlds, so Gustav, Emil, and Gavin didn't like compete together while I was working with all of them. But Gustav and Emil, I basically asked the individual lifter and said that, are you okay with me working with your competitor? I think that working with someone that trusts you, that put their trust in you, is loyal to you, right? Like I said, anybody like Emil can go to anyone to coach him. When I first started working with Emil, I was surprised that he picked me. At that point, I was still relatively not as well known for my non-nutrition coaching, right? People do know that I do some pretty decent stuff with my nutrition coaching, but Emil picked me to help him with his training. And I tell everyone at Worlds, right, the 93 battle will be the battle that break my heart, because whoever wins, I'm gonna feel sad either way. Because it's Gustav and Emil, and they're both like friends as well with one another, and they're friends with myself. So my personal principle is that if someone were to come and work with me, and that lifter is a direct competitor in the other person's weight class, I will ask the lifter that I've been working with first, saying that this person has contacted me. How would what are your thoughts? And obviously I would always place my loyalty with the people that I work with, because them giving me the opportunity to work with them means a lot to me, right? So I always want to take their feelings and how they feel into consideration, especially when things are like tightening up. I had this conversation with Joey Flex at Wolves, because obviously you had Russ on the podcast, right? And then they were talking about nutrition, and then Joey was saying, oh, what if Russ wants to work with you? Then I say, I just have to ask Durin first, that is my principle, and if Durin says no, then no. Right? That is literally my principle. I say it'll be great to work with Russ. I think working with people is great, but I think working with high level lifters is something special. But let's face it, right? All these people are still people, right? And I would treat the people that I work with first, giving them precedence because of the bond that we have. And I would do my best to preserve the bond that we have, because I know that plays a big role in our working relationship. The minute the lifter has any form of doubt, right, that would cause issues in how we work with one another, and I don't want that. So I will always speak to the lifters that I work with if a direct competitor would ask me for help.
This is bound to happen. Your name's getting huge in powerlifting, especially when you start pulling off what you're pulling off. You start doing what you're doing with some of the biggest lifters on the biggest platforms, and everyone's watching. People are going to start reaching out. It is what it is. It goes hand in hand with success. And I think I've heard both, and I understand both. I get from your perspective, I get where look at if you're doing nutrition for me, you're doing nutrition for someone else on the day of, like it is what it is. Make him be at his best when we face each other. The day of, you're not handling me and handling him because you're going to have to make choices that'll directly impact me and could fuck me. And that can happen in powerlifting. And if someone doesn't understand how if one person handles two people who are going head to head and they're close, they don't understand game day handling. And it's crazy to me that there's still those people out there who are super into powerlifting and don't get how if the same guy is handling two athletes going head to head and they're real close, somebody's going to get fucked. It's not a max out day. It's not a max out day. We can't pretend it's a max out day. We're not going in the gym and all things are equal. We're just going to max out whoever wins. Powerlifting becomes who's the better powerlifter on the day, and the game day coach can do that. I'll get Matt. I don't want to. I'll get Matt Gary on the podcast. We'll go on that. But in terms of nutrition, that's not the same. It's different to say when people get it mixed up and they talk about game day handling like it's nutrition. It's like, no, well, I want him at his best. No. Let him prep with whatever program. Let him do whatever dieting and nutrition. On game day, you separate. That's different because someone's actually going to impact you by calling your numbers and your opponent's numbers. But in terms of prep, yes, let him get at his best. And when I compartmentalize those two, I agree with you. You can work with two opposing people if the one athlete. First off, I like that you ask the athlete. Because let me tell you, let me know. And the athlete could say, you know what? I'm the type of guy, let him be at his best. I think you're the best, Kedric. Let him be at his best. And then when we face off, there's no excuses. You're at your best. I even gave you my fucking coach. So don't tell me you weren't at your best. And then I'm going to beat you. But on game day, Matt Gary will never pull you aside and say, do you mind if I handle the other guy as well? By the way, I know all your attempts and I know the lot numbers and the body weight and everything. And do you mind if I do both at the same time? Be like, yeah, no, I got a problem with that. I even got a problem with you asking. As a matter of fact, now I'm getting a little squirrely on this conversation. But also, let me also say, I 100% still agree with if you do ask an athlete and the athlete says, I got you. Let it be at its best, all the rest of it. But I also still agree, even if an athlete says, you know what? You're 100%, because some people like this and I respect it. They're like, you are 100% in. You are in, and that's it. It's just me. If you want him, it's him, but it's not both. It's some people, it's like, it's something to do with your life, the way you were brought up or something. It's like, nah, you're with me or you're against me. This is what Penna said one time to me when I was in France. He didn't mean it. I have people, other 66s all the time, but they're joking around because they're tight. They keep, right? And but they're passionate. And I get it. So I can see both. I can really see both. A lot of it's a mental thing. A lot of it's not like, were you afraid if you let the guy also get that kind of coaching? No. It's more, I'm a passionate guy. We're going to war here and you're on my side or you're on their side. I don't look at you. Or you know what I mean? Like you were in when we go in there or you're out when we go in there, but we're going in there to battle. And it's a mental frame. Whatever, when it comes to high-end athletes, I don't fuck with none of it. Let them do whatever they got to do to get wherever they got to get to perform when it's that type of pressure and that many people watching. And in terms of that many people watching, now we'll have like 500,000 people watch Sheffield, as it stays on YouTube. And then God knows how many people want to split up in the clips and passed around. So anyways, admirable, my friend. Let's talk about when some people make the opposite decision, like Taylor Atwood, whom you work with and sings your praises. And Taylor, who actually was an old nemesis of Kjell, they went toe to toe at world championships, won world titles against each other, old rivals, was in the comments saying Kjell couldn't have picked a better nutrition coach to reach his goal. Taylor's actually opting to go the opposite route and going 83. And he's saying, and it's good to have this kind of yin and yang attached to it because you can't only go one way. There's also, you can go the other way and see gains. And Taylor's saying, look at same age as Kjell, father like Kjell, hard work, whatever the whole nine, been around the block for years, just like Kjell, and moving up a weight class and saying, my God, these extra calories in terms of my recovery, how I feel. You see him in the posts, you hear him in the captions talking about, I've never felt this good in years. I finally feel like I'm getting where I need to get. And he attributes at least a chunk of it to gaining weight and no longer restricting and trying to stay 74. And as a matter of fact, he was on the podcast not long ago. And he said, now that I look back, I think one of the things I regret was not going 83 after I've already won. What was he at? 3 world titles. And he's like, I had already done that at 74. I should have went 83 when I had the opportunity. And just he still can, but there was an opportunity previously already. And he's like, I wish I would have done it already before all the injuries, etc. But how was that going? How did that conversation go to move to 83? How was the training been going? And on your side of it, as the nutritionist, how do you feel the extra calories have gone for him recomping and finding the second wind?
Yeah, I think for Taylor, it's interesting. In the podcast, he mentioned that, we had that the meeting of the minds, or whatever you want to call it, at Sheffield. It seems that all this uh body weight class changes for the former 74 goats happened at Sheffield 2024. So we had that conversation, just right outside the dining area, right? Taylor, Jason, Ben, Scott, Taylor's dad, right, and myself, right? We were just having a conversation talking about where the direction for Taylor would be, and at that point, we talked about multiple topics, right? So I just simply brought up, I think the two things that I brought up that I felt was important in that conversation was, the first one was, hey, let's look at what are certain things in your life, right? I said you have to list down what your non-negotiables are, right? Because like whether that's family, whether that's work, right? You have to list that down, because if you are consistently, like, for example, let's just say spending X amount of time with Owen is one of your non-negotiables. And if you're consistently breaching that because of training, right? You'll be, during your training, you'll be thinking about like, what a crappy dad I am, like, because that's something that is non-negotiable for you, and you're breaching that, having that mindset in training will probably not be the greatest. So I said that I'm not going to tell you what your non-negotiables are. Obviously you have explicitly said in your podcast that Owen has been the best thing that has happened. He changed my life. So I would assume that time spent with Owen is one of them. But I'm not going to tell you what to do. You decide what your non-negotiables are. And then the next thing I said was, then you have to think, is eating more, right, and going up to the 83 something that would help you execute the non-negotiables better, because if you have those non-negotiables, it means that you have to do them, right? And there's the easy way or the hard way, right? And then the question is, you have to decide which way is, whether going up or staying at 74 will make it easier or harder for you to execute your non-negotiables. And if you think eating more is the way to go, and if you can execute your non-negotiables well, I would say that that is the cornerstone and the key for building your training on top. Because if you can't even handle your non-negotiables, right, your training is going to suffer. Like I said, you'll be thinking about stuff that you should be doing right now instead of training, right? And then obviously we also talk about recovery, right? His work, the amount of stress he goes through with his work, giving him the freedom to eat, right? Knowing that even if he doesn't, I mean, this is probably something that I would say that Taylor can still do better, right? And he knows that I would tell him that even though he doesn't report back to me, right, it's not the end of the world, because he doesn't have to go down, and that itself is one less mental stressor for him, and it allows him to have more breathing room in other aspects of his life, and he can think less about what are the negative outcomes if I don't do things to maintain at 74. And then based on the conversation, he decided to go up, and I said, that's great. I feel that I also agree that based on your current lifestyle, that is probably more conducive, just from a perspective of managing stress. I mean, at the end of the day, the food that you consume, right, is providing resources to your body to recover, right? That's one. right? Eating the things that you enjoy may not necessarily provide your body with the resources in terms of nutrients or energy intake, but it provides you sort of like a mental recovery as well, so having more freedom to eat, that takes off the mental stressor, right? The worst thing you want to do is after a stressful day at work, maybe Owen is sick, and then you go back and you look at your macros, and you look at your tracking app, and you have 300 calories left, but you really want to eat a burger right now, right? That's the worst thing, one of the worst things that you can face in terms of your nutrition. But now that you're moving up, you don't have to think about that. If you want to eat the burger, you just know, cool, I'll eat the burger now. I won't think too much about it, right? I don't even have to feel guilty, and life goes on. And it's not just that I don't have to feel guilty. It's, you can also think of it as, yeah, you can kind of like rationalize it, saying the burger is probably helping me gain some weight too. Obviously I don't want to do it too often, right? For reasons of like, I'd rather pick foods that are higher in micronutrients than something that's not. But you can think about framing things very differently when you're moving up the weight class, and I think that really helped Taylor make that decision. And yeah, he said he's never been healthier. And we also know for a fact that pain is a very complex topic. It's not like, oh, I'm injured, right? I have some tissue damage, therefore there's pain, right? The perception, right? The stress that your body goes through can increase or decrease the sensation of pain. And if you're consistently in a high state of stress, what you might be feeling right now may be much more painful compared to if you're in a state of relative like calm. That same pain would be much lower based on stresses. So if there are ways to kind of like dial the stress down, right? Maybe Taylor would just be able to train more frequently, be healthier, just for the sheer fact that the sensation of pain has been dialed down slightly. So I think all of these factors, I can't really say which is the main contributing one, but a combination of what I've mentioned has really helped him with coming back, I guess, the comeback, if you would like to term it that way.
Just giving perspective on Owen, his son, and how that's a priority. I brought it up on the podcast with Taylor, but he missed the world championship because Owen was being born. Okay. Now, God bless. He could have had an extra world title. Owen turns 18. I'll be like, did you understand what I did for you? You understand? People say 3 when they could have said 4 times. All right. I made sacrifices, son. When you can never lose an argument now. You got that on him. But no, and since then, since he made that decision, I 100% agree in terms of stresses, in terms of pain, for sure. When you're under stress and when cortisol levels go up, even trying to lose weight, it gets more difficult. And they say you got to remaining calm is big for a lot of things in life, stresses, anxieties, and it lowers, the pain threshold. You could withstand more, lowers the pain, however you want to word it. But for sure, even all that, I definitely see that, or it's just less stresses, but also even, how do you think in terms of the influx of calories might have impacted it? Because Taylor's saying he's feeling strong again. And how does all that relation work? Do you think?
Yeah. And this is kind of like the things that I speak to, at least this is the framework I use when I coach the lifters that I work with. So the influx of calories, I look at it from two perspectives. One is the acute phase, meaning what happens in the short run, and the second would be what happens in the long run. So in the short run, you would potentially, like I said, feel slightly better with slightly elevated energy intake, especially if you're coming out from a deficit. The impacts may be slightly different if you are going from a maintenance to a slight surplus, right? But if you're coming out from a deficit and into a surplus, you would generally feel better. Your sense of well-being would probably be higher. The mental aspect would also be much you will have like a better mental state as well, right? Research from bodybuilding shows that refeed doesn't necessarily change metabolism, but it helps people adhere to diets better, and they feel better because of the psychological benefit, right? So like I said, that psychological benefit happens in a very, very short run, right? And I think that the sheer fact of having more energy when you train would also be a contributing factor, even though for that to happen, you don't necessarily need a large amount of calories, because powerlifting isn't really that energy consuming, right, compared to others like sports like endurance sports or UFC or stuff like that. So that's in the short run. And then from the moderate to the long term, right, the ability to pack on more muscle, right, is going to be a big contributing factor. Like I said, that as I mentioned prior, the research currently shows that people tend to peak when they're 30s, right? And that is probably because they have been able to accumulate a large chunk of muscle mass, right? Let's just assume that most people do not have at least when we look at a retrospective data point, right? Just looking back at the data from like people that has been lifting, I would say up until recently, most people don't really start resistance training till they at least go to university, right? Resistance training in high school is not as common yet, right? It's getting more common for sure. So let's just assume that people start roughly around 17 to 18, and you have 10 years of resistance training, right? And assuming that during that 10 years, you don't really cut much, right? So you have that slow increase in muscle mass, right? And then that realization of muscle mass into strength, right, probably happens when you're 28 to 30, right? That could explain why some of the lifters peak at around that age. So that is kind of like the view if you look at it from that perspective. And then now you kind of like take a chunk out of that, right, and put it into what Taylor is doing right now. You're basically trying to say, okay, cool. I have been in 74 for so long. Is there still opportunities for me to take a time frame to gain muscle in the moderate to short run and then realize that muscle gain further down the road, right? So that is probably the moderate to long-term impact. And I would probably say that for Taylor personally, whatever he does in the next meet is not the max he can do, just because, like I said, it takes time for your muscle to, I wouldn't say like transfer, but it's more like for your muscle gain to actually carry over to maximal strength, so that is kind of like what I think is going to be taking place for Taylor. So just a quick recap, short term, right? Slight increase in energy intake, ability to perform well in training sessions, probably mentally feeling better. So your ability to execute will be higher, right? Moderate term, slight increase in muscle mass gradually over time. And the long term would be the realization of those muscle mass translating it into maximal strength. So at least that's kind of like how I see the timeline on what a potential surplus can do. And that is also why I think that a lot of lifters, right, other than what we see in powerlifting, I mean, Agatha is really an outlier because she hasn't really been training that long, right? But Agatha is also very different. Like her build is, she's quite stocky. But like the Evie Corrigans, the Team Morigatis, the Kjell that are going down weight classes, they've been lifting weights for years before they started going down. So that is also a reason why I think that for other than these lifters out there, 95% of powerlifters shouldn't be thinking about like going down a weight class or cutting weight, especially if you're very, very young. You're nowhere near your peak. And you probably, you haven't been resistance training consistently for like 5 to 7 years. You shouldn't even give like going down a weight class a thought, unless obviously it's health related issues. Like, if your doctor say like, okay, you're actually like obese, like your fat is way too much, unless it's a health related thing.
That comes out of your doctor's mouth. You
Yeah.
are full on obese. And that's it. That's a wrap, son. That's a whole nother conversation. Yeah, you got to lose weight. That's different.
I tell people that 95% of powerlifters shouldn't be thinking of going down a weight class, but I also think that people shouldn't use powerlifting as an excuse to get obese and be metabolically unhealthy, so both sides of the coin.
Like those memes that are like, congratulations, you became obese for a fringe sport, or at the very least your participation in it was on the fringes. If the sport is growing, it's like, good, you threw some kilos in your total, you're now diabetic, and congratulations. Have fun with that. That's your other prize that you won, by the way. Tim Monagatti dropped down, moved back up, and now he's stronger than ever as an 83. I mean, he's going to Sheffield, and he's going to be right up in the mix. He's hadn't filled out 83 kilo, and he totaled 88 45.5. 845.5. And that's well over what he'd previously done before he cut from 83. So him going back up, excellent decision. And he's still not filled out, let alone doing any kind of water cut leading into the 83 kilo weigh-in. So imagine he does. And he's thinking he's right up in the mix with both Jurgens and Russ. So you see it both ways. You see people cutting, you see people bulking back up, and it's got some people confused. What's the best pathway for me? Let me ask you about this. Joey Bornstein, talking about 83s, was talking about Russ. And he said, Russ, I've noticed, is staying leaner now. And he's hoping, obviously, that the weights he's moving in the gym will be a lot closer and a lot easier to estimate what they can anticipate on the platform. Stands to reason. Joey said, I'm just wondering, and Joey's not saying he's a nutritionist or whatever, but he's saying, I'm wondering, staying that lean, and Russ looks lean. Russ looks diced. He's as diced as we've seen him in quite maybe ever. And he's saying, I'm wondering, could he be too diced? What does that do when your body fat's that low to your hormones and what that might look like? Or is he not that diced? And we're talking that's bodybuilder diced when you got to start worrying about that. Is that ever anything that you felt you've had to worry about where someone's getting too shredded, too diced? You're like, my friend, how are you feeling? Is your body fat getting too low? Or is that something that's not, we're probably 9 times out of 10 not going to see in powerlifting?
I think obviously there's research out there looking at people who are really shredded over extended period of time, especially when you look at bodybuilding research and the negative impacts of that. I think that if you have other guests such as like my PhD supervisor, Dr. Eric Helms, to talk about that, he can tell you all about it.
Yeah.
But I do think that for most powerlifters, they don't really reach that level, at least for extended period of time. Like for example, we talk about bodybuilding prep. I had a conversation with Eric, and Eric was like, I asked him, oh, are you preparing for any bodybuilding prep right now? He said, oh yeah, if you are actually thinking about October 2025, then yes, I'm preparing for a bodybuilding prep, So that's like how far ahead that they think. And usually when they look at the competition, the first bodybuilding show is not the best show, because after the first bodybuilding show, they already dies, but they have a refeed, and then they have like a couple of more shows in the next couple of months, and the last show for that bodybuilding season is when they are usually at the best. So they could be spending like 1.5 years just being in a constant state of most likely a net deficit, right? That is when issues will start to pop up, So the thing that I'm concerned about, and this is something that is starting to be more prominent, is the health aspect of things, in terms of, we know for a fact that just looking at if you eat less, right, you're gonna eat less things that are nutritious, right? So let's just assume you have 2,000 calories and you're eating the exact same food when you have 1,500 calories. Even though you have the exact same food choices, the fact of the matter is that you're getting less micronutrients in because the quantity of food has gone down, right? So because of that, there may be certain aspects where you might be deficient in certain areas, and that might cause issues. For example, vitamin D, right, is a very important vitamin when it comes to athletes, resistance training, bone health, which also probably contributes to some athletic performance, especially if you're a real athlete, not that actually do some form of running.
Like you sweat when you're participating, you mean?
Basically, yeah. And
something.
Yeah. So vitamin D is like a fat soluble vitamin, right? And the easiest way to go into a calorie deficit is to actually cut out fat intake, because fat has the most calories per gram, right? But if you're cutting down fat too low, right, it may impact the ability for your body to absorb that vitamin D, right? And then you may be vitamin D deficient. Not to mention, a lot of people now don't spend much time outdoors, right? Also, depending on the seasons, all right, during winter, you don't get much sun. If you live in London, you don't get sun year round, So things like this would actually cause some form of deficiency. So those are the things that I tend to worry slightly more compared to if I look at the lifter itself and say, if you are diced, you are going to have issues, right? I don't necessarily think that is the case. But how long you maintain that state, that would probably make me question and want to look a little bit deeper into things, right? And in the grand scheme of things, like I said, 6 months, 5 months, it's not that long compared to what bodybuilders go through, and that is when the issues will start popping up.
That's what I figured. That it probably wouldn't, especially like, although Russ is lean, when you want to compare it to bodybuilding lean, like stage ready lean, you see the difference. And it shouldn't be, I mean, you would feel it from your day to day if it was like literally so lean it's messing up hormone levels or whatever, or anything like that. And what about, but Joey had a good point here also, though, when he said when he was younger and he was cutting, he feels like maybe the cutting on the nutrition, cutting on the calories, and this is, I don't know if you've ever read anything about this in particular, but when you're in your teens, restricting calories, would that impact the size you grow to? Because he said this, and I was like, you know what? That's not the craziest thing. And then some people heard the podcast, were in my DMs, and they're like, well, if you look at some nations that resources, they're third world nations where there isn't a lot of resource, people aren't eating like us in Western nations and North America, et cetera, and calories are restricted. Some people are small by the time they become adults because as they're growing, they're not eating as much. And maybe it isn't that crazy to say. I don't know if now we're getting a little out of pocket here. This is getting a little specialized. I don't know if you know anything in that direction, but have you ever, does that sound reasonable or?
Oh yeah, 100%. I think that also makes the case for why I said, back in our previous conversation, that there should be no weight classes for sub juniors, right? Controversial hot take.
Hot take.
And I stand by that decision. I also still stand by the decision that the comment that I made today, where 95% of powerlifters, especially if you haven't been lifting for a good, like, lifting in some form of calorie surplus, right? Packing on muscle mass for like 7, at least, right? Maybe an average 5 to 7 years, you shouldn't think about going down a weight class. I stand by that. And what Joe Bornstein has said makes a lot of sense, because I always say that, as people go through puberty, right? That is when, especially males, right, makes the most gains, right? In terms of going through puberty, right? And during that time, if you have the adequate resources that you're placing in your body, you're actually maximizing that potential. You only go through puberty once, right? So if you're actually
No, she
cutting
would have
during,
told me this younger. Dog. My brother, when we were kids, was a little chubba muffin. Just a little chubba muffin. Homie, 6'1.5" now. I turned out to be 5'9", and I was six-pack Lapadat in high school. Dog, I found out too late, man. Anyone who
yeah,
listen to podcasts, don't do yourself like that. Don't
yeah,
don't do yourself. Eat and grow. Okay, go on. Sorry.
yeah. So I think it makes a lot of sense to provide, when you're at your prime, when your body is at its like prime level, to actually produce growth, right? You want to be supplying the necessary resources for your body to grow. You only go to puberty once, but you can always cut down the road. You can always go through a calorie deficit down the road. Like I said, Kjell is 36. He's doing the biggest cut he has ever done in his life. And there's obviously multiple factors that would happen, but I think the very interesting thing, you brought up different nations, right? And the average height, right? Because I think one thing to consider as well is also genetic factors, right? So if you compare different nations, obviously, different like ethnic groups have different genetics as well. But I think one clear example is North Korea and South Korea, right? We know. I mean, I was about to say we know the state of North Korea, but we really don't know much, about North Korea. We know, but what we know is that North Koreans and South Koreans are genetically the same. They are like the same ethnic people, right? But they are separated by obviously different governmental regimes. One deprive North Korea deprived the population of like necessary resources, and the average height of an adult male in North Korea is around 165 centimeters, which is 5'5". 5'5" for the average male. Sorry, it's 5'5" for the average male. And in South Korea, right, the average height of an adult male, it's around 5'9", right? So 4 feet
God,
in difference. So
that's
it's
literally
100.
like a nice little test sample size for us right there. What a
Yeah,
perfect scenario to test the theory. genetically the exact same. Only difference is, by the way, you just offended all my Northern Korean King of Lift listeners, and there's a lot of them. I'm gonna get a lot of DMs, but I'm sorry, everybody. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. And the crazy thing is that South Koreans are actually the tallest on average. South Korean males are the tallest males in Asia. So it says a lot, like the North Korean had the potential to be the tallest males in Asia. And the females, right? Uh the average height for females in South Korea is around 5'4", which is 163 centimeters. And that's just 1 foot lower than the average height for men in North Korea. So it says a lot, that the average height of South Korean women is actually almost the same as the average height of North Korean men. So that is, obviously nutrition plays a big role, right? If you actually heard like stories of like North Korean dissidents, sometimes people just eat like tree barks or like they hunt for insects in the trees, things like that. Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
there's going to be some exaggeration and sensationalization to create a good story, but it does show that the access to nutrition, and obviously healthcare, right? Understanding the sheer fact that you can look at malnourishment and then try to reverse that would probably happen in a country that know what malnourishment is and have healthcare to reverse that issue. So even if you live in a country like North Korea where malnourishment probably doesn't really exist, then everybody would just be like, oh, this is just a regular state of life. So that is, I think, a good case study to be made where people are genetically similar, but through external factors, right? Like there's the genotype and the phenotype. So the phenotype is like the environmental factors, or we call it epigenetics, right? That impacts how a person would develop. So I think that's just a good case to be made, and there's definitely something there on what Joey B has claimed, and that's the reason why I stand by my claim as well, that no weight classes for sub juniors, and 95% of the powerlifters shouldn't even be thinking about cutting if they haven't really spent a good large chunk of time in a calorie surplus gaining muscle mass.
Literally, all sub juniors, all these lifters under 18. If you're listening to this, if that doesn't convince you to not cut and just eat until at least you're a full-on adult. At least you make it into the juniors, you're after 18. I don't know how much people actually still grow after 18. Maybe a little, some people are completely done, whatever. But if you cut before that, and this is probably the best argument to not have weight classes as a sub junior. Because you're going to have some hard people who are going to be like, look, it's tough. They're young. And some people like, yeah, tough, don't care. Tough. It is what it is. Life's tough. Get over it. Yeah. Well, how about this? This guy could have been 6'2", and his whole life is different. And now he's 5'9" and hosting Kingless podcast. How do you fucking like that, huh? You ruined his life. Anyways, let me get going before I get all caught up. I have some other questions here. We're talking about metabolism. I don't know if there's some. I know this is. I don't know if this is necessarily in your realm of expertise or not, but there's some myths around this as well. I think, or at least some misconceptions. We'll say metabolism. I've got people. Look, I'm in my 40s now, and I see people who are my age posting on, and some of them are like, look, I'm X amount of age. Metabolism slowed. It is what it is, and they start talking from there. And I'm like, hold on a second. You're my age, and we don't look like we're the same age. Are you absolutely sure that's your metabolism or your lifestyle? And people talk about, Lane Norton's talked about, Lane Norton also in his 40s as well, diced. Now there's lifestyle as well, but how much do we know metabolism slows? And I understand metabolism is a bit of a tricky subject because it's different for everybody from when you're in your teens to 20s, 30s, etc. So we're kind of talking in generalizations here. But do we know, about the metabolism, and when can we expect in general it slows? What are possibly some factors towards it? And I don't know how much we know or how much we're hypothesizing at this point, or what kind of research has been done on this.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think we briefly mentioned about it in like one of our other podcast episodes as well. But recent research from the lab led by Herman Ponzer. So he's actually an evolutionary anthropologist, and he did some research in human metabolism, right? And what he showed at least what the research shows is that around the age of 60, right? So roughly from 20 to 60, that is when your uh metabolism doesn't really change much, right? From your 20 to 60. And after 60, your metabolism does gradually begin to slow down, but not as sharply, right? Or not as much as what people would think, right? The change in the drop in metabolism is actually very gradual, with roughly, around 0.70, like 0.7% to 1% per year.
Oh
And then,
God.
when you reach 90, that's when, you probably have like 20 to maybe like 25 to 30% lower daily, your metabolism dropped by roughly like 25 to 30%. But most people nowadays don't reach 90. So but I think that it's very interesting, because I think when we look at that, there's obviously like criticism on why this would happen. People talk about, like, does this population size actually translate to other population, right? He did it in a like specific like tribe, right, where they are like hunter gatherers. So that's actually one of the criticism. But what we do know right now is that the biggest contributing factor, right, that to your metabolism, so your metabolic rate, excluding your energy expenditure, right, so excluding like your steps and your activity, would actually be your organs, right? So your organs are actually the thing that consumes the most energy, right? And if you think about it from perspective of growth, it makes sense when, let's just say, we said that, oh, we don't really know, you mentioned just now, we don't really know how many people would grow past 18, right? So when we reach, like, let's say the age of 20, right, we could probably say that, yeah, cool, our organs are probably at the size where it's like probably fully functional, and all that kind of stuff. And then when we reach 60, it's then when the organs actually start slowing down, you know. So and therefore, I'm not saying that this is the fact, because obviously we don't really know, like, the population that was studied, they didn't actually check their organs functions when they're 60, right? But if your organs start slowing down, right, and gradually slows down, and we know for a fact that organs start malfunctioning as you grow older. That's just the fact of life, right? So the energy consumption from those organs are actually much lesser, you know. So I think it makes sense from that perspective, especially if we know the biggest contributor, uh, the biggest contributor of our organs would also be, the biggest contributor to metabolism would be our organs. And even if we factor in muscle mass to the equation, sarcopenia, which is like the muscle loss when you're aging, also happens around 50 to 60. So even if we assume that muscle mass plays a big role in metabolism, it makes sense that metabolism starts dropping when your body goes through the natural state of muscle loss when you're around 50 to 60. So I would say
That when
that
muscle loss
probably,
comes is 50 to 60?
I mean, yeah, most people would experience that. I think women do experience it slightly at a lower uh, age, just because of like menopause and more hormones. But I would probably say that I'm not sure about that, by the way. That's what I assume. But yeah, I would think that like those things that are, if you just think about in our body, what are the things that consume the most energy, and when do those things start slowing down or breaking down, and you just piece the puzzles together, I think that the research makes sense, at least based on what uh, I'm currently, at least based on what we currently know.
It When we look at some of these powerlifters in the masters, that makes a whole lot of sense. Some of these people are extremely muscular, jacked, the whole nine, and they can maintain, like again, Lane Norton, who's also obviously a nutritionist and is going to keep himself in check. But it makes sense. And some people look at it like, oh, they're just outliers. Maybe, but more likely than that, some of these people who are older, kind of like you had said, if you were always building muscle in the gym when you're younger, by the time you're 30, you've accumulated the muscle mass to be peaking through your 30s. Opposite is also true, where people are like, well, how come all these people in their 40s are fat, doughy, soft? And it's like, same thing. No, their metabolism didn't change, but they've been accumulating and peaking, if you will, in the wrong direction with body fat. And it just accumulates because they're not working it off anymore. When they were younger, in school, high school, college, did you play sports? Gotcha. Did you stop afterwards? Probably, huh? How'd your food and intake come? Your output goes down, your intake goes up, and that accumulates over time. So when people look around into their communities without any kind of information on fitness and weightlifting and dieting, etc. And like, wow, everybody by the time they're middle aged is chubby. That's where the rumor and the myth started coming around about metabolism slowing down around the middle age. It's like, nah, probably not. The truth might hurt you. You did it to yourself. You could still turn it around. You could still do things, but it's a lifestyle. It's more of a choice than you might think. But anyways, it's interesting. It was interesting when Lane brought that up, and I think a lot of people don't realize, and they don't realize the potential they have. But all right, so let's talk about talking about food, processing food, etc. Yeah, I was listening to a podcast we were talking about beforehand. This came up on a Joe Rogan podcast. Somebody's talking about GLP-1, and they were talking about weight cutting, or I don't know much about it. I just heard it on the podcast. I shot you a message, and I'm like, my friend, I'm interested. And then this will probably be a nice segue to get into some supplements, because obviously sports in general, not just powerlifting, but a lot of people take supplements, etc. So we could start talking about different supplements and whatnot. But what is this GLP-1? And they were talking about it like it was controversial.
Yeah, I think GLP-1 is like interesting, right? So obviously it is in the limelight now because a lot of celebrities are using it. You know, like people like Oprah Winfrey, started losing a lot of weight while using GLP-1. So essentially, what GLP-1 stands for is like glucagon-like peptide. So one, right? And it mimics something in our body called glucagon, which is like the opposite of like insulin, right? And what GLP-1 at least nowadays is marketed as is it's basically a weight loss drug, right? So I think when we kind of like look at weight loss drugs, or at least like, there are two ways that we that we actually can induce weight loss artificially. The first one would be through increase of like trying to artificially increase our metabolism, right? Through consumption of something, right? We talk about metabolism just in the previous section. So that's one, right? So you actually increase what the energy expenditure internally, right? And a lot of the drugs that have been tried in those cases didn't really increase metabolism to a large extent. And those that did actually is quite harmful for health. So if you think about it, right, to actually increase your metabolism in your body, you have to ramp up certain processes, right? As I mentioned, the biggest contribution of energy expenditure that happens in our body is in our organs. So and if we are actually ramping things up, like for example, like things like adrenaline, like if we ramp up adrenaline, right, sure, we have a nice spike in energy expenditure, but your organs will be working really, really hard. And that means that there's a lot of detrimental health effects when you try to ramp up your metabolism artificially. So that's why a lot of that sort of like all the drugs that look at increasing our energy expenditure internally doesn't seem to work. But what GLP-1, right, is, or at least marketed nowadays in popular forms like Ozempic, right? That's what people use. That's the brand. It functions in a different manner. So instead of ramping up the energy expenditure internally, it prevents energy from getting into your body, right? So it's kind of like a massive appetite suppressant, So it suppresses the appetite, which means you don't eat as much. So that is like the mechanism of how it works. Because at the end of the day, right, when it comes to weight loss, right, not differentiating between muscle mass or fat mass, right, it's still energy balance. So the first drug tries to increase energy balance on one end, right, by increasing what happens by burning more calories, right? The second, the drug like Ozempic, right, is trying to target the other end by preventing those calories from even getting into your body in the first place. So that's roughly how GLP-1 works. And there are also the three factors as well that kind of like at least the mechanisms that the thing with GLP-1 is that it seems it has been in the limelight recently, like say because of like celebrities using it, but research has actually, we can actually date research on like GLP-1 back to like couple 20 years plus, because people actually started using that primarily to treat type 2 diabetes. So one way that GLP-1 functions is, so if we look at people who are diabetes, they usually have some form of like insulin resistance, or their pancreas cannot secrete insulin, right? So artificially, what some people do is that they artificially inject insulin. But what GLP-1 does is it actually stimulates the pancreas, right? So it signals the pancreas to actually kind of like give out to secrete insulin, right? And then obviously that is, people say that, oh, it's probably better than artificially inducing taking an insulin jab, because at least this insulin is produced naturally by your pancreas through some form of stimulation. So the GLP-1 functions in that manner. It raises insulin to get rid of all the blood sugar in the bloodstream. So it started from like diabetes research, right? So there's actually research that has kind of like backdated couple of decades, right? And it's not like, oh, cool, this thing just suddenly pop up in the market. But what people have done is that a lot of this GLP-1, the thing with like glucagon, the reason why they don't use like the inject like glucagon specifically is because there's something known as the half-life. So what the half-life is actually the amount of time that it takes for a particular substance or chemical to reduce half the the dosage into half. So for example, the half-life for caffeine is roughly 6 to 8 hours, meaning if you take 100 milligrams, right, in 6 to 8 hours time, it will be reduced to 50 milligrams, right? So the amount of time it takes for that substance to reduce into half. And like early stages of all these things, like those glucagon or drugs have very, very short half-life. So like some even from 2 minutes, and then slowly through modifications like what we have now, like Ozempic, they basically attach stuff towards that thing, so it has a longer half-life. And I think that if I'm not mistaken, it actually lasts in the body. The half-life of the body is like 6 days. So it
Holy
started out from like,
smokes.
yeah, it started out from like two minutes ish, and then now it lasts for like almost a week. But the thing is this, right? Like so, the function for those things to stimulate your pancreas, right? Probably would work okay if you have a short half-life, because you just need that sudden like increase in insulin, right? And then you're good. But if you want to stimulate, the next thing it actually stimulates certain hormones in the brain to actually down-regulate your appetite, right? And that is when the increased half-life actually matters, because we know appetite is something that happens that can last, longer than 2 minutes, So if you are actually having an elevated increase in hormones that suppresses your appetite for that six days, it means that you will have a reduction in your appetite for the entire length. However, if you use the initial products when it was first developed and it's only 2 minutes, let's face it, 2 minutes appetite suppression probably doesn't do much, for you. So what that does as well is, the big thing is that it modulates your appetite, right? Obviously, there is the additional benefit of increasing insulin and managing blood sugar levels. So that's another thing that GLP-1 or Ozempic, also known as like semaglutide, would function. And that is actually the main driver of how they actually work in terms of creating weight loss. It's basically like having a gastric bypass without a gastric bypass. So that's kind of like, to put it very, very like simply. But there's also a lot of like more research coming out where they say like certain substances in the GLP-1 can actually like impact the inflammation caused by beta cells, and therefore there's also like some additional health benefits. But obviously there's also like just like any drug, there's also like some side effects that will come through it, because one thing you say is that GLP-1 basically suppresses appetite. It doesn't tell you what to eat. So when you're hungry, you still, at the end, you still make the choice on what you want to eat, right? So it doesn't tell you what to eat, how much to eat, and things like that. So that is, I guess, I guess that's the brief breakdown of what of how GLP-1 or Ozempic kind of like functions.
So tell me if is this being overly simplistic if I say I could take GLP-1 to suppress my appetite, or I could just exercise discipline and not eat that food. Either way, I'm not going to, if it's just don't take in the calories, is it just raising the hand and saying, I just don't have the discipline to not take those calories in? Give me a pill? Or is that overly simplistic? Am I being too, Ryan, that's harsh. Don't say that. But it sounds like either way, it's just literally make me stop eating. make me eat less. And couldn't someone say just eat less? Be okay with, look, we talk about being okay with pain, etc. Be okay with being hungry. Be okay with feeling a little hungry. And you just that's just, am I being overly simplistic? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that at the core, the mechanisms make sense based on what you say. But I think that this is the reason why I think that people who are not like are having obesity, right, shouldn't be looking at using Ozempic or GLP-1 as a drug just to suppress their appetites. But we know that different population have different sort of like psychology and their ability to resist hypopalatable foods, right? So food environment actually matters. There's one study that's pretty interesting where they look at actually a reduction in food advertisements on like buses. So like, like buses, they always have like advertisements and stuff like that. And what they did, they actually reduced the advertisements of junk food, and that actually caused a reduction in consuming those kind of like highly processed foods. So food environment matters as well. And something that is actually present in a lot of obese population is that they tend to have a harder time, right, resisting certain foods. And sometimes it's not just because they're weak, right? It's like when you're already obese, and you have metabolic issues, like your hormones are already all messed up, right? And if you do lead an unhealthy lifestyle, whether that is by choice or not, right? For example, if you work shift jobs, so sometimes you just have to work shifts, and we know people who don't sleep enough, right? They have higher levels of higher appetites, right? So it might sometimes be just sort of like a byproduct, right, or occupational hazard, right? So there are mental aspects as well that go into the ability of someone to be able to regulate their appetite and control stuff, whether that is by their own doing or not. So, but most people who are obese do show that common theme is that they can't keep their weight off enough. So that's what, when we look at The Biggest Loser, for example, one of the craziest and worst TV shows ever, where people actually lose a lot of weight, but all what they struggle with is the ability to keep their weight off, right? And I'm not trying to say that these people have a psychological predisposition to already be in that state, but the combination of environmental factors, maybe occupational hazards, and the fact that maybe just a sense of hopelessness, right? That's like, I'm really fat, I'll just like die like this. I don't even have like, I'm never gonna lose all this weight, right? And we know for that even activity levels help regulate appetite, right? So it's basically like an inverted U. So if you have too high of activity levels, it will stimulate appetite. But if you have too low of activity levels, your appetite would also be kind of like stimulated as well. So you need some moderate level of activity to manage your appetite well. But people who are already obese, they probably don't really move that much, right? So even that can down-regulate their ability to keep their appetite in check. So what I think is that drugs like this, right, at least Ozempic, might give people like I would say hope that it's still possible, right? And I would also like one caveat here is that, like I said, I'm not a medical professional, so I'm not recommending anyone take it. But based on the research that's out there, I think practitioners that prescribe Ozempic should look at it from an approach that is multifaceted and holistic as well, because you want them to be able to keep the weight off, which means that they should know, okay, cool, when I'm not hungry, I'm not eating, right? I want to be able to, when I eat, I want to be eating nutrient-rich foods, right? I want to eat things that keep me full as well, right? So I want to have good micronutrient intake. One of the criticisms of people on Ozempic is actually muscle loss. But the fact of the matter is that muscle loss happens in any form of weight loss, especially if you're not resistance training. Like I said, Ozempic doesn't tell you what to eat, doesn't tell you how much to eat. And the general population already consumes very, very little protein, which could also be one of the contributing factors why their appetite regulation is poor, because we know that protein does regulate appetite to a certain extent. So if you're already not consuming protein, if you're already not exercising, and if you when you have Ozempic and you're in a massive calorie deficit, your body still takes the energy from somewhere. So it's definitely going to take it from your muscle as well as your fat, right? So just to create the energy balance within that system. So like I said, that lifestyle changes, advising what to eat for people, even when they are on drugs like this, is actually going to be the critical factor on how successful Ozempic would be for this person. So yeah, I guess that's a really, really long answer to your
Love it
question.
though. Dude, it's very interesting because this is popping up. Is this not the drug that Lizzo was taking that took a whole bunch of heat or
Yeah,
similar of?
I think so. Yeah, I think that most like celebrities now are using this, you know. But then again, you know, like I just think that we shouldn't be taking any form of advice from any celebrity whatsoever,
Oh, come on.
whether
That's
that's
where I seek
health,
all my advice.
yeah, whether that's health,
Political.
whether that's freaking politics, or you know whatever that you should do with your life or how to have a family. You know, you probably shouldn't take advice from celebrities because they are like they live a very different life from all of us. So, but it's
That's
definitely
to
in the
say the
limelight
least.
because of these people.
Well, the thing is, Lizzo was like, big is beautiful type deal. And then I see a way out and I just got to pop a pill on the way out. So I'm taking it. It's like, well, hang on a second. What are we talking about here? That wasn't me preaching before. In terms of how people become obese, is it now we're going down a bit of a rabbit hole. I'll bring us back to supplements. Don't worry, but I'm getting interested. Um, and this might not be anything you know about. So let me know, like if we're going down too far of a path, off the beaten path, we'll come back. But how much of it is thyroid or metabolism or because it's interesting, obviously, it plays a factor. But how much does first off that in terms of obesity? Second off, do you know if there's a lot of variation between metabolism from people to people, like we see? Does anyone? I don't know if there's been a lot of testing on that.
Yeah, I think genetically that is for sure, right? There's something called I mean, research usually classify these people as like thrifty genes or spendthrift genes. So one thing we have to remember is that whatever luxuries that we are currently enjoying, or at least we can talk about now in the context of this podcast, is something that is not uh bestowed upon us by evolution. You know, evolution doesn't ideally would not put us in front of a computer screen. Evolution also probably doesn't require us to have large amount of muscle mass, just because it's in a time of famine. If it does require a slightly higher amount of energy intake to maintain this muscle mass. That's why when you are in a deficit, muscle would go as well. Because your body has no reason to preserve it, which is why we do resistance training and have high amounts of protein. So I would probably say that biology and evolution does play a role, and I think that different populations over time, right, would develop certain kind of different metabolism based on the genetics. And something that I have kind of like been looking at, I mean, not looking at, but it's just like one of those rabbit holes that I tend to get distracted by, would be something that looking at like mitochondria efficiency. So what mitochondria is like the powerhouse of the cell, right? So it's in the cell. It basically powers all the cell. And some people have a very efficient mitochondria, which means that for the X amount of calories that they consume, they actually they don't need as many calories to they don't need as much energy as the other person to generate the same output, right? So in that sense, it's good for survival, right? Which is something that evolution is concerned about, is survival of the species, compared to someone who is not not efficient with their mitochondria, which means that they need more energy intake to have the same amount of output. That means that they need more calories to, let's just say, walk 10 steps. So one person might be able to walk 10 steps with 50 calories, where someone who is not as efficient might need 100 calories. So in terms of weight loss, it's more beneficial for the person that is more who is least efficient, right? Because they need more resource for the same output. But in terms of survival, it's better for the person that is least more efficient. So in in a state of famine, the person that has that needs more energy to produce the same output will probably die first, just because they
That's
need
true.
more energy to sustain their life, right? That's why I said, like, yeah. So that's kind of like something that plays a role, and I look at certain like subsets of population as well. There are some studies that show that specific ethnic groups, particularly women, do show that their mitochondria efficiency is slightly different. Obviously, like things like thyroid as well. I can't really speak too much in the clinical aspect because I'm not a clinical dietitian, but we know that thyroid hormone actually does regulate stuff like that. And sometimes it might not be like a single direction causation, meaning that you have a bad, like, you have issues with your thyroid, then you will be obese. But sometimes people just pack on a lot of weight and lead very unhealthy lifestyles, or they use certain kind of substance that may damage their bodily functions, and then it impacts their thyroid, right? So it can be causation in both ways. So yeah, there's multiple factors, genetic factors, and like health factors that could impact your metabolism as well. So whenever we look at studies as well, I think it's very important to look at what what the demographic of the study population is. People will say, oh, people are usually metabolically healthy, right? And then we always have to make sure that the sample size that they're looking at is actually homogeneous, or actually it can translate to yourself, right? Just like basically you're a relatively normal human being with no underlying medical conditions and probably resistant strain. But in terms of the actual clinical aspects of stuff, I don't really know much on what causes what, but I do know that there are factors that would impact it. And the only reason why that I was interested in mitochondria is because I used to do research back in the day for endurance athletes, and mitochondria is a very important thing for endurance athletes, right? Because you want to be able to produce as much output as you can for long periods of time, which is why the mitochondria plays a big role. So a lot of the things that I know is probably at least tangentially related to sports performance. So if you go deeper into things that are completely unrelated to sports, then my expertise dwindles the further you go away from
I
sports.
love conjecture too, buddy. I love just throwing out conjecture with no science behind it. It's a lot of fun. So would that be endurance athletes, those that have a slower metabolism, so they eat less, or like if me and an endurance athlete ate the same amount, that amount of calories for them would be gangbusters because their metabolism's slow, so they can run longer. Whereas that amount of calories for me, if I have a faster metabolism, is not amazing. So when we both take off and run a marathon, I'm going to run out of gas quicker than they will because my body's not as quote unquote efficient.
I would say marathons now are very different, because if you look at marathon runners, you know, it's like they're trying to break the sub 2 hour marathon, you know, that is like
Mm.
ridiculous, because you basically run at like 22 kilometers, almost 22 kilometers an hour. And normal human beings, no powerlifter, I mean, even some trained endurance athletes would not be able to sustain that pace for like more than 5 minutes, you know, like it's actually crazy how people are able to sustain the pace in that sense, right? Because I think what boils down to, I think when it comes to sports, they have very different, what we call it is like bioenergetics, meaning that we tap into different energy pathways. Like powerlifting is very, creatine phosphate or ATP, creatine phosphate focus, because it's like a maximal attempt, right? And then on the far end, you have ultra endurance, where you basically just go like for 150 kilometers in the Sahara Desert, right? At the same pace, right? Then you would say that people who are more efficient would probably benefit from that, because their activity levels is slightly more like flat, right? They don't change much. But if you have like UFC, for example, it's a mix of endurance athletes, right? Versus sorry, not endurance athletes. You have some endurance element, but you also have like short bursts, right? I think that it gets a little bit more complicated if you have different, you tap into different bioenergetic pathways compared to someone who is flat. But I think that ultra endurance lifters would probably benefit from like, just having a very efficient metabolism, because they're basically just, let's see who can walk to the end, basically in the desert. That's
That
basically
doesn't
the
sound
sport.
fun at all. Let's
Yeah,
see, the way you worded it to the end almost sound morbid and dark. It's like, let's see who walks until you can't walk anymore. Let's have that
yeah.
game. How fun does that sound? All right, let's do that this weekend. Um, how about it's interesting to me too, because I had Gavin on and he's talking about the amount of calories he had, and Gavin's thick as a house. And I eat more than him, and he is huge. I was shocked how little he eats, like in terms of calories. It's not like crazy, but it's like 2,300 and whatever, something like that. I'm ballparking. But I was shocked. If you've seen Gavin, I would have thought he ate as much as Shell, who's a 74, cutting down to 76, in Shell, who's like eating 4,000. But no. And it's interesting how, and it's not like Gavin's fat, it's muscle. So sometimes bodies off of less, like, or not just less calories, can have heaps of muscle on it. Incredibly muscular, like Gavin Aiden. I forget how much, I know I've had Russ on a million times. I can't remember how many calories he eats, but I doubt it's going to be as staggering to when you see how muscular Russ is. And some people can pack on muscle mass and convert energy to muscle with resistance training easier than others. It kind of is what it is, right?
Yeah, I think that there's also this is another thing as well where you look at like hyper responders, non-responders, and just normal people, right? I think that if you look at people at the top, we can obviously like I said, make certain inference that all these people are at least in the top, like 1 to 5% of the genetic pool for packing on muscle mass, right? So that is definitely there, right? So they are probably like hyper responders to certain activity levels, right? And like I said, the body doesn't really concern itself with, oh, I'm eating X amount of calories today. It's more of like, how much energy do I need to produce a certain outcome, right? So we can say, and then the thing is that for non-responder, I wouldn't say non-responders, but poor responders, they need a greater stimulus, right, from training. Some people need to train twice as hard to get the same amount of muscle mass compared to other people. That's also something that that plays a role as well. And like the sport itself self-select for certain kind of people, right? People like Kjell, right? People like Gavin, right? They self-select because, like I said, Gavin's not gonna Kjell and Gavin, they're not gonna play basketball. Let's face it, right?
Yeah,
And
that's a
if
fact.
you
But
look, if you were to look at the profile of like energy expenditure as well for basketball players, it's going to be very different from them because certain sports self-select for certain qualities that you need. So I think it's very hard. For example, for me, right, I'm not like a great powerlifter. The only thing that I'm good in, I think Anna posted a post, right? Mr. Stats guy posted a post, saying like the percentage of your total, right, in terms of the percentage of each lift, and your total, right? So my when I look at my total, right, I total basically, I'm just doing a brief calculation here. So yeah, so my deadlift is roughly 46% of my total, right? So basically I have like really, really, really long arms, But the fact of the matter is that doesn't mean that I should be my squat isn't great, right? So that doesn't mean that I should be a power lifter that only deadlifts. I should probably be swimming, because long arms probably help you in swimming,
you go, should I be a
or
power lifter that only deadlifts? Your coach is like, nah, it means you should be swimming. It means you should be throwing. You're not even in powerlifting. You're throwing a
yeah,
baseball. It's a pitch.
yeah, yeah.
Like,
Or
okay,
maybe I
good.
could
All right.
be doing some like boxing, right? Because I have a longer reach for my
Got a
arms,
jab.
things like this. Yeah. So
Got a jab,
like certain
Playboy.
sports do self-select for certain things. And I think that it's very different to I think that to take one person and say, oh, your X amount of calories that you consume, uh if you consume X amount of calories, right? And someone that's roughly around your height should be consuming the same thing, right? Uh, then I don't think that is I don't think that that's like useful information because the first thing is also we also have to take the person's word for it, right? And uh, Gavin would probably uh corroborate this, but we know that Gavin's not the strictest in terms of his nutrition, right?
That's
So we are taking one time
yeah.
point where he said I've tracked for one time point and I roughly consume X amount of calories in this specific time point. But when we look at metabolism studies that we actually show, they literally took the time for 20, only when you're 20 years old to 60 years old. That's 40 years worth of like data points compared to like, yeah, cool. Whether it's Gavin Adian, whether it's Kjell, or even like Heather Connor, she consumes like heaps of calories, but she's like 47 kilos, and back in the day when she used to compete as like a 45 kilo lifter in the 47 kilo class, she's already consuming so many calories, right? But we are taking like specific time points, right? And we don't have like a 10-year time point to actually say, okay, this is roughly how much you actually consume. So I think it's just very hard to draw any conclusions, especially if you're trying to make comparisons that will impact recommendations to a certain lifter.
What makes it that certain people, though, let's say two people are the same height, um, two people are eating the same amount of calories, but one person is far more muscular. Same calories, same height, but one person could turn into a Russell Orhe. Same resistance training. Let's say everything's the same. We know some people just in terms of putting on muscle mass. Is that metabolism? Is that what is that? Do we know? I mean, there's other hormones out there, obviously, natural rates of testosterone or whatever. I'm not sure. And again, we're getting a little off of nutrition and getting into, other areas. So maybe this is some studies that you've taken a look at. But
Yeah, I think that I think genetic factors is probably one of the biggest thing, right? Certain genetic traits would actually uh play the largest role. The fact of the matter that we see like self-selection of certain genetic traits in certain sports speaks a lot, right? When it comes to powerlifting, we look very specifically at one subgroup of population, right? And we assume that everybody should be the same, right? Because I think that the perception is that powerlifters are often like, at least the negative stereotype that powerlifters are often athletes that are wannabe athletes that kind of cannot make it, then they go and do powerlifting. But I think that it's very important to look at certain things. And I think the biggest thing that we can actually see on how genetic factor plays a role is certain like genetic mutations. Like I don't know if you've seen those dogs where are like really muscular dogs, where they actually don't have like certain things that myostatin, right? We call it like myostatin, lack of a myostatin thing, right? Without that, you can just like grow muscle, and you look like the abomination from the Incredible Hulk. So
what if you remove something you can?
I mean, yeah, you probably would die as well, but because your body
Dog,
would
worth
just
it. Hey, listen, you sold me in the first half. You're not scaring me away. That 24 hours, I'm gonna be a legend, right? But listen, if you told somebody you're gonna die 6 months later, I guarantee you some people would sign up and be like, give it to me. What is it? As a matter of fact, all jokes aside, back in the early 2000s, Sports Illustrated did a survey in the Olympics that just rolled around, and they surveyed all of these Olympic athletes. And I forget how it was a huge survey, thousands of Olympic athletes during this Olympic year. And some of the questions were, would you win a gold medal if it meant you had to die within 4 years of winning the gold medal? Would that be a trade off you would consider? And it was I can't quote you the percentage. It was staggering how many said yes. And down this rabbit hole of what they would give for, I mean, it's a gold medal. Now, that was early 2000s, if you doubled back at some of these people who won gold medals, and we're not talking the Michael Phelps of the world, some of these people won gold medals in these fringe sports that nobody cares about unless the Olympics rolled around. Be like, how much did that gold medal change your life, huh? Was that worth dying for? Do you think? A lot of them be like, no. I would tell anybody just live life, huh? It's a lot better than that. But anyways, getting off track here. Sorry, man. Were you saying something before I got into this?
no. I just said that
Okay.
like the biggest, like if you look at, I mean, you can just go up and look at like Belgian blue cattle, or like just myostatin deficient animals, and you can just look at the massive amount of muscle mass, right? So that is something that the gene, right, it's called MSTN gene, that plays a big role as well in regulation of muscle mass. And certain people have more, certain people have less. So yeah, that's basically, I think genetic variations play a huge role in how much someone can pack
I'm
on muscle mass.
I'm not a doctor, but I think I'm going to diagnose right now. Gavin Aiden is myostatic deficient. Okay, that's right off the hop. I'm not a doctor, and you, my friend, might have very high levels. There it is. There's two diagnoses right there. I think you're fine. Myostatic. I can't even pronounce it. What? I'm playing Playboy. You're muscular. You're a handsome man. I seen you with a toothbrush. It's amazing. Um, let's go back on to supplements. We took a little weird path, but it's been fun. Let's talk about B. So here's something that I haven't heard a lot about: BCAAs. How how much are they really needed in terms of cutting? When are they useful? Are they as useful as people say? Because I remember back in the day when it was cutting, I was told if you take BCAAs, maybe over tame more muscle mass when cutting. But now I've also heard in other places it's a big fat waste of money and don't buy BCAAs. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I think in most cases, BCA. So I mean, for the listeners that don't know what BCAs are, right? BCAs are basically branch change amino acid, right? So it's three essential amino acids. So in our body, right? So amino acids are required, for especially muscle growth, right? So the three essential amino acid in BCAAs are leucine, isoleucine, and valine. And what between these three uh, amino acids, the most important one of them is leucine, because it plays a huge role in stimulating muscle protein synthesis. So I think that the first thing that we have to like draw things back and take things down is that what is the pathway of like muscle growth? Usually what happens is that you do some resistance training, right? You stimulate the muscle, right? And then there's something called mTOR, right? So it's an mTOR pathway, right? And when you have high enough leucine, it increases the mTOR signaling pathway, and that usually translates to MPS, which is muscle protein synthesis. And that is briefly how things work, right? And what resistance training does is actually it increases the sensitivity towards protein and elevates it for good like 24 to even in some cases even like 2 days. So what happens is what people say is that, oh, okay, cool, if we know that leucine in particular is in helps stimulate muscle protein synthesis through the mTOR pathway, then it probably will help us increase muscle mass. However, there's research actually showing, and I think that this is just the amazing thing about like our body, is that our body regulates everything very tightly. So there's a certain threshold where they look at they keep like increasing the signaling of mTOR, right? So the mTOR pathway, it keeps going up, but MPS just like flat lines after a while, right? Because and it just doesn't go up anymore, right? So that shows you there's a certain amount of threshold, and based on that, what happens is that for most people, the implications that for most people that are consuming sufficient amount of protein, right, they probably don't need BCAAs. Not to mention the sensitization of muscle protein synthesis after resistance training makes your body more sensitive towards it. So BCAAs are also probably not needed. There's also some research that actually showed that if you have BCAAs, it actually competes with certain amino acids as well, and that could actually reduce the signaling rate of MPS, right? So I think that's just one study. I can't remember who the author is, but they actually showed that if you add certain stuff in, right, it actually has a lower signaling pathway. It leads to lower signaling compared to if you just have whole protein sources with sufficient leucine. So for the listeners out there who probably want to know how much leucine that you rate, I mean, when I say probably, I use it really loosely because some people just don't care. You roughly need around 2.3 grams to 2.5 grams of leucine to maximize that muscle protein synthesis pathway. And you can usually find that in maybe one scoop of most high protein, high quality whey protein supplement would be sufficient. And roughly 25 grams of whey protein or even like 30 grams of protein from meat will be more than sufficient to actually activate those pathways. So yeah, BCAAs are probably not really useful. A lot of people like to drink it during their training session because it tastes like a fruit juice, you know. And I think that a lot of this BCAA stuff, that the hype on it was built in the like the early 2010s, where people start looking at the importance of leucine in the signaling pathway. But more and more research has shown nowadays that it probably really doesn't matter. Back in the day as well, when I was actually considering doing my PhD, I spoke to one of the researchers in protein. They do like protein metabolism. So the two big labs that does protein research is one is in actually Canada, right? I think it's like McMaster University in Canada.
Dude,
yeah,
that's real close. That's in Hamilton.
yeah,
Close to like Toronto and like, yeah, okay.
yeah. So that is one of the most preeminent protein labs, led by Stuart Phillips, right? And then actually there's probably three. One of them is in the Netherlands, but the other one is in Scotland, right? I think in I can't remember what university in Scotland, but and it was led by the late Kevin Tipton. When I say late, it's because he passed away like a couple of years ago. And one of Kevin Tipton's student was one of the professors that I was talking with, and I said that one thing that I really wanted to do is that I would bet that consuming, and this was like in the early, like maybe like 2012, I said that there will probably be no difference when people consume enough plant protein compared to animal protein. And this is coming from a guy that is a hardcore meat eater. I love meat, but I say that, based on the research, based on what I look and how actually resistance training sensitizes your muscle to sensitizes your muscle to muscle protein synthesis. There's going to be no difference whatsoever. And I'm not saying I'm a prophet, but recently, like the past couple of years, there's a lot of research showing that people have the same rate of muscle mass consuming plant protein supplements, right? So I think that
Is that right?
people, yeah. So people often,
Dude, are you a
I mean,
vegan?
no,
Calling
I
you
mean, but
calling you out right now.
look at Sophia Ellis, she's jacked, So,
You're not a
and I
vegan
mean,
though?
no, I'm not. I do
Okay,
like
okay. I thought
Evie.
this was vegan propaganda right now. I'm like, I'm calling your card right now. I need to know right now. Okay, okay,
I
cool. All right.
I I mean, me and Gustav bond a lot on our steak and rice, So definitely can be a vegan, not with that amount of steak that we consume. But yeah, I think that people often put too much of an emphasis on the roles of certain things that can increase muscle mass because people would like want to increase muscle mass quicker, But the fact of the matter is that there's not much you can do legally, right? Except legally that would actually increase your muscle mass to at a increase it at a quicker rate than what your body can naturally produce. Because like I said, evolution does not select for increasing muscle mass. So you have to put in a lot of work over a long period of time before you can gain muscle. And if you don't do enough work to maintain it, right, you will lose that muscle, which is why actually maintaining your muscle in a deficit, right, is actually harder than to do. Sorry, you need to place a higher emphasis on like things like protein and stuff, rather than actually gaining muscle. To gain muscle, you just have to train hard and train long. And unfortunately, that's the that's the formula. That's the formula. So yeah, BCAA probably, I would say, is expensive juice probably.
And there's the soundbite right there. There it is, Playboy. Took us a little bit, but we got it out you. What about pre-workouts? A lot of people pre-workouts, it helps people get to the gym, helps people hit PRs, raises that natural internal hype. It's very difficult to resimulate the hype you get when you hit a platform. My God, the energy slash anxiety going through your body. That's why PRs get smashed. But when you put 8 hours into work and you show up at the gym, you throw on your music, it's difficult to get that kind of hype going and the energy and the tingling through your body. So people convert over to taking pre-workout. And obviously, pre-workout has caffeine in it, and we know for a fact caffeine works, but there's a lot of other stuff in it. And some might wonder, is it glorified caffeine with flavor on it? In previous pre-workouts that were at least around this area, and I'm talking North America, Canada, and US, had other stimulants in them that had been banned. Now, I'm not sure why they were banned, but how does that change of ingredients change how pre-workouts work? This watered down, no pun intended, version of pre-workouts, just how potent is it?
Yeah, I think that uh I would say that most of the pre-workouts out there, even the ones promoted by your favorite powerlifters, is to a certain extent uh glorified caffeine, with glorified caffeine that tastes like a really nice cup of juice once again, because it's usually some form of fruit flavor. And the reason why is that people will always say that, oh, this is backed up by the science, right? But a lot of them are not, the dose that they use is not uh useful, right? And some of the supplements, like for example, let's just exclude caffeine, right? So we know that uh caffeine actually works, right? That's probably one of the most studied ingredient in the pre-workout, right? But then if you look at certain things like for example, another thing that is very commonly used, and we are using this in the context of powerlifting, is like L-citrulline. So L-citrulline is actually a vasodilator, right? Is essentially it increases the size of your blood vessels and actually sort of like purportedly increases blood flow to the muscles, right? Some people say that it helps you do more volume, but what we know is that citrulline works when the rep ranges goes really high, towards the 12, maybe 10, 12, 10 to 20 repetition range. That is probably when the impact, you feel it more. And the fact of the matter is that most powerlifters don't do that for their main lifts, right? And so it may actually benefit a bodybuilder slightly more than powerlifters. So for example, L-citrulline probably doesn't really work as well for powerlifters as what people claim. So that's one. Another thing could be a common ingredient that is actually found is also beta-alanine. So beta-alanine acts as a hydrogen buffer. So whenever we sort of like, go through exercises, when, for example, our body produces lactate, and when lactate breaks down, it produces hydrogen ions, right? So, and hydrogen ions, the beta-alanine would sort of like buffer that hydrogen ion to prevent the onset of fatigue. So that is the thing that when people consume, it gives them like, it feels like ants, like we call it like paresthesia. It feels like ants like crawling on their skin, like this itchy feeling. So that's from beta-alanine. So people put that in beta-alanine, it gives them the placebo effect that things are working. But the fact of the matter is that you need to consume beta-alanine. Beta-alanine is like creatine. You need to consume them for extended period of time, right, before it starts working. So unless you're consuming your pre-workout every single day, including the days that you don't train, it's likely that the beta-alanine is not doing much for you besides giving you itchy skin, And once again, the hydrogen ion buffer also only works better when it comes to higher repetition ranges compared to lower repetition range. So that's another popular ingredient that probably does work. Another popular ingredient that people usually put in is called like betaine. So what betaine does is they call it like our cell, they increase, it like draws water into the cell, right? So it's a cell volumizer. And what people say is that, it helps with increasing the pump, maybe it gives you slightly more ability to produce more reps. But what people don't actually know is that when the impacts of betaine is actually, for most people who already consume creatine, right, it basically functions the same. There's a study where they look at creatine and betaine combined versus creatine only, and the effects was literally the same. So you don't need betaine, right? And like I said, a lot of these things that quote unquote cell volumizers only works better when you actually when you increase your the amount of reps that you're doing. And the fact of the matter is that most powerlifters don't really go past 8 to 10 repetitions for their main lifts. So those are like very, very common ingredients that people actually use. And something else that is actually put in the supplements now would be like cognitive enhancers. So like things like alpha GPC, right, or acetylcholine, right? So those are things that sort of like improves your cognitive focus and stuff like that. And a lot of that might help, right? But you have to actually get like the dose right. And usually the dose that's required is probably around the 1 gram range. And a lot of these cognitive enhancers are actually like really, really expensive. So I don't know what the actual ability to produce significant gains are for the price that you're paying, right? And things like acetylcholine as well, you can get from eating eggs, right? So you don't you don't need it to be in your pre-workout, if you just eat things that are high in like choline in general. And the last bit for me that I think that really irks me the most is when people put theanine in their supplement. So theanine is basically something that is found in tea, right? So it synergizes well with caffeine. So what it does is that it actually allows people to consume caffeine, but it regulates the negative impact of caffeine where it prevents people from sleeping. Right. So we know caffeine for a fact helps people stay up a lot. And because of the relatively long half-life, as I mentioned in the start of the podcast, where it's roughly 6 to 8 hours, right? People can, if you actually train with pre-workout in the evening, you're probably going to have impacted sleep at night. And theanine actually downregulates the negative impact of that. And research actually shows that, right? But at least every single, okay, I wouldn't say every single, because I haven't scoured the earth looking under every single rock for every pre-workout formulation, but most pre-workout formulation actually underdose their theanine. That is because theanine is not as cheap as caffeine, and the dose for theanine in research is actually the ratio of 2 to 1. So for every 1 gram of caffeine, every 1 gram of caffeine, you should have 2 grams of theanine. I'm not telling people they should have 1 gram of caffeine because that's a lot, but the ratio is 2 to 1. So most people actually have like 300 milligrams of caffeine and 50 milligrams of theanine. That's not going to do nothing. You're just basically putting another expensive ingredient in your supplement, and the price will just go up. So you're actually better off without that. Things like that. So personally, I think that most pre-workouts are glorified caffeine with a hint of juice flavor, and they sell well because they taste good and your favorite powerlifter likes them. Things that would probably work is that a caffeine would work with an appropriate dose of theanine to mitigate the impacts of the negative impacts of sleep, and probably just getting some electrolytes before your training for hydration. So any form of sodium intake will probably work, and all these things are not that expensive. So yeah, you save much more money doing all of this. But if you really like expensive tasting juice and you want to support your favorite powerlifter by using their code, by all means go ahead and buy the pre-workout.
What about some of these ingredients, sorry, that have been banned in pre-workouts? Are some of these legit? I mean, they got banned, so they must have something to them. I mean, I just looking at a couple here. I don't know if, I mean, off the top of my melon, I know previously they had ephedrine, DMAA, DMHA, stuff like that. Like there's different ingredients that had previously been used in pre-workouts. And these are stimulants, and they got banned for a reason or rather anyways. And I know, I mean, I was talking to some people at some of these powerlifting events, and some people were full on telling me, now this is off the record, but they were so into these supplements that when they heard they were being banned, stocked up in their basement with bottles. I mean, that's how good it was. And I'm like, my God, I'm curious to have gotten my hands on some of these and just experience what was it? Why was it so potent? It must have been working. It couldn't have been just psychological. And I know, even for instance, Mr. Hyde had to change its formula. In the old Mr. Hyde, and I forget what the ingredient is, but that for sure I remember taking previously. And my God, it could have been just the caffeine, unless it was all because something got banned and the formula had to change. So there must have previously at least been some ingredients, or could there be other reasons why they got banned and they just weren't healthy? It doesn't necessarily mean there was better performance. It might have just been unhealthy, and it's like, no, we're not banning it just due to performance levels are so off the charts.
Yeah, I think the most fascinating case is DMAA. So if you've been in the lifting industry long enough, right, you know of this supplement called Jack 3D, right? So
That's the one
yeah,
my boy was talking about.
yeah, that basically has, I mean, the old version has DMAA, and that was the thing that really works. And the thing with that DMAA is that basically DMAA is 1,3 dimethyl alanine, right? And it has basically it's a chemical, the structure chemically is the same as meth, So
Is this like amphetamines?
yep.
No, dog. Amphetamines that's no joke, man. They were giving people amphetamines essentially. That's crazy that you got a pre-workout and be like, hey, do you want some speed? No
Yep.
wonder people were going nuts when I got taken off. They
Yeah.
turned us into meth heads.
Basically. And I think that that is that definitely has increased focus and alertness. It improves your energy because, like, I mean, it's basically like a drug, right? But the biggest thing is actually it's disguised as a pre-workout, right? But there's a lot of like health risks as well that comes with it. So things like when people consume like these supplements, they always have like increased heart rate. You also have to remember that a lot of this type of stuff that acts on like the pathways, like even like caffeine. If you consume a lot, you have a lot of a high dose of caffeine, you have really increased heart rate because it actually signals like your body to secrete a lot of like adrenaline, right, into your body, right? But the thing with the MAAs is that the big thing is that the market is pre-workout, right? And if people want an extra boost, they just like double the scoop. So, but let's just say someone who is a meth head, they will not be like, oh yeah, I probably should be, I should probably like hold back on the meth because if I like overdose, I would probably die. But DMA is like, oh yeah, it's a pre-workout, I'll just double the scoop, and then people get like heart attacks because of that. So
You can't just
like that.
double up that quickly.
Yeah,
That's how quickly the decision is. I'll
yeah,
do two today. Got a big deadlift day.
uh that is something that was banned and was taken off the shelf. So that is the most popular one. And I think another one is I think in other popular supplements, like it might be Mr. Hyde, they have something called yohimbine, right? So yohimbine is a bark from a tree, where basically what it does, it basically acts very similar to caffeine, but it leads to a lot of like issues very similar, where you have like high levels of adrenaline secretion, right? And it increases your heart rate and blood pressure. So like Mr. Hyde, I think if it has yohimbine, right? I think certain yohimbine is not banned in the US, right? And this might dovetail in our next conversation. But it's banned in Europe. So obviously, if you want to
Oh,
have and I mean, if it's banned in Europe, it's probably banned in Canada as well, right? Because I do think that Canada's food regulation is more similar to Europe than the US. So if you want to actually have a cost-effective supplement, you just make the formulation the same, right? So you don't have to produce two different type based on the region. So people just remove yohimbine, but yohimbine actually basically acts on the adrenergic receptors, right? And it basically secretes a lot of adrenaline in your body, and that basically why yohimbine was banned. So these are the two things that, those are the two things that actually would impact, that actually works, but
mm,
actually is banned because it has quite negative health consequences. Because if you think about it, it goes back to the same idea of the metabolism thing, right? To have a higher power output, right, you need your body to be functioning more. It needs to function harder, right? And all of this kind of stuff, right, actually pushes your body to that extent. And the more you push it, the more dangerous it becomes. So I think that if you can think of it from that perspective, it's very, very similar.
not only that, I mean, look at if the government finds out, excuse me, yeah, you have record sales. You're selling meth. Yeah, I bet. You, yeah, yeah. Fourth quarter's looking lovely, isn't it, fellas? You're, what's your next one? Are you going to sprinkle a little cocaine in there? I mean, yeah, it works. Of course, those sales work. Did you see New Jack City? Yeah, it's gonna be good. We can't let you do it. You got to take it out. That's what's gonna happen. But that's interesting. Now, I wonder if there is DMAA still available in the US, or it must be gone, right? Do you know?
Yeah, it's it's basically, I don't know whether they can sell it, but uh it's re- like it's restricted use. So I
Yeah.
don't know what people, DMA is not, you cannot market DMAA as a dietary supplement, basically. So you cannot just buy it off the shelf.
That makes sense. There's one thing to be you can't buy it. There's another thing to be, but you can if you're buying it, you know what you're buying, as opposed to, hey, you think you're coming to me to help your workout, and I'm sprinkling in stuff like that. And that's like, all right, how many of these meatheads know what they're taking? That's not fair. Like, let's separate this, and that makes sense. Well, all right. I mean, last podcast we really got into the different restricted ingredients in a lot of different foods and whatnot. We really went down that rabbit hole. If we got time, we could double back into that. But before we do, there's a couple other things I want to ask you about. Um, Before I forget as well, sugar and insulin levels and that spiking. I've also heard podcasts talking about, and these were not, nutritionists, but we do know obviously sugar, it's not broken up the same, and there is insulin spikes, etc. But to what extent, if you're working with people, and obviously you have micronutrients, macronutrients, and people have carbs and a certain amount of carbohydrates they're allowed. But to what extent would it be if someone has X amount of carbohydrates and they'll have 4 donuts that day, taking up a huge amount of their carbohydrates? How much does that spike levels within and impact them. And how much is it? Nah, it's not that big. As long as you stay within your carbohydrates, it's not that big what the carbohydrate is.
Yeah, I think like I said, when it comes to food choices, selecting foods that are higher in micronutrients will give you the most bang for your buck for your calories. So let's just assume that those food choices are we are aware of the impact of food choices, right? So let's just exclude micronutrients for the purpose of this discussion. And the next thing would then be kind of like nutrient timing, right? So it's likely that if you ate donuts, and donuts sit relatively well in the stomach, and you're going to train, it's probably not going to impact you because your body would basically utilize those blood sugars. You utilize those carbohydrates when it's broken down into glucose. Because what happens when your body, when you exercise, your body actually is available to transport sugar in your bloodstream through a non-insulin pathway, right? So essentially there are two ways to get rid of sugar. One, the main one is through insulin, right? And the other one is through exercise, right? So when you exercise, you upregulate certain receptors to on top of your like cells, and then that absorbs sugar, and you don't need insulin for that. Okay, so that's another thing. So if it's likely that you consume a high chunk of sugar, right, or carbohydrates close to your training and you're exercising, right, the impact would be less. However, if you're relatively sedentary, right, you have to know that one thing that happens is that blood sugar levels are also like blood sugar levels increases, insulin actually increases to get rid of all the blood sugar because you can't really have blood sugar floating around your body. If you have a lot of that, it's known as diabetes, right? And what happens is that sometimes when the blood sugar level spikes up, right, a huge insulin spike when you consume like carbohydrates only, right? There will be huge insulin spike, but once you have no more blood sugar in your bloodstream, right, that is called like the crash, right? The sugar crash, right? So it's basically happens when too much insulin is released, right, and blood sugar drops very, very rapidly. So that is the that is quote unquote what the sugar crash happens. And I think a lot of that that sugar crash and that feeling for what people get is actually impacted by like your mood and your perception, right? They actually look at when they look at studies, it impacts like mood regulation and all that kind of stuff. One thing you also have to remember is that our brain uses glucose as its main fuel source, right? So that is probably another thing that it might be impacting, how we feel about stuff, right? And most likely when we look about stuff like blood sugar levels, we feel like, oh, we feel tired, right? That is like, it's not our body suddenly felt like we just run a marathon and our body's fatigued. It's like we just suddenly feel tired. So the pathway that's regulating it a lot has to do with the brain, right? So, however, the very interesting thing is that a lot of these studies, when we look at them, they actually are trying to prove a certain concept. So what they do is that they get these people to eat a lot of sugar or like high GI carbohydrates and high GI carbohydrates only, right? But most of the time, this doesn't really happen in real life because people eat meals, people eat food. So they eat a combination of things. And what they do is that what it does is that it slows down the rate of insulin, right? So technically, sometimes like even for a donut may have fat, right? So fat could actually blunt the insulin spike slightly, right? Because it is not digested as quickly, right? So the spike's not as sharp. But I'm not saying that there won't be a spike, but most people in real life wouldn't actually feel the spike if they can actually eat whatever they're eating alongside uh other food stuff and not just like consuming raw sugar on its own. So yeah, that's kind of like, I guess, how insulin plays a role, the sugar spike, the sugar crash. And one thing to also remember is that when you eat food in general, blood flow goes into your stomach regardless of what you eat. So you would probably feel a little bit more tired just because a lot of the blood flow is in your stomach just for the purpose of like digestion, right? So it may not necessarily be attributed towards sugar crash, right? But it's more just how the body functions, which is why most time people after lunch in the day, they just feel slightly more tired after lunch, you know. And sometimes
Like,
I can be eating like chicken and I still feel tired, you know.
so the sugar crash isn't really as prominent as people think and are telling themselves. Like a lot of times it might just be a mental thing where it's like, okay, it's the afternoon, you're probably just going to be tired. Like you change up your diet, but you probably, all things being exactly equal, you may or may not, you might be telling yourself, man, it's getting later in the day and you feel a little tired. Get out of work and all of a sudden, no, you got a bolt of energy. It like it's the sugar crash as prominent as people are telling themselves then.
I think that it's not when you consume a mixed meal. If you are consuming a pure sugar source, then yes, it's more common, right? When I say common, I'm not saying that it would necessarily happen, but it increases the probability of it happen within that individual relative to
Mm.
themselves. Because the way people handle sugar through insulin is very different. You know, people who are, for example, people who are diabetic is a clear example of people having problems with insulin, you know, compared to other people who are metabolically healthy. There's also very individual differences on how people would have insulin, like the secretion of insulin is can also be influenced by genetic factors. So I would say that if you consume a large dose of pure carbohydrate source on its own, it increases the probability of you experiencing the sugar crash within yourself. I don't think you can say that, oh, me and you, right? Or you and your brother who is 6'1",
That
would
brick.
experience the same thing if you consume the same amount of stuff.
What? How do people turn themselves into diabetics if they're not born like that?
Oh, actually,
Because I
this
think
is
I told the line was, I bet you I've told that, brother. I bet you I told that line.
yeah.
I got a
I
sweet
think
tooth.
I think it's like super interesting, right? Like I think first of all we have to look at the difference between type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. Obviously, there's a big difference there. But I think in general, if you're asking people who are not diabetic and they become diabetic, right? It's usually due to it's an intake of food. So it's not just sugar, it's calories in general. So what happens is this, right? So this is something that I studied back in my master's. So I haven't really looked into it much. Like I said, the further it goes away from sports performance, the less my expertise matter. But because you like conjecture, I can just recollect
Yeah.
what I've studied. So
Yeah.
what happens is that when we consume food, our body has to break down those food, right? So we heard of common terms like antioxidants, right? Antioxidants, we consume like fruits, like broccoli, you know, like citrus fruits. They're high in antioxidants, right? So what antioxidant does is that it basically binds to free radicals that are produced by our body, that also naturally happens during natural processes, and that natural processes would simply be breaking down of food. So every time you break down food, think of it as you put your body produce some byproduct, and that would probably look, we can call it as like free radicals, right? Or and that is when we can term that process as oxidative stress. Okay, so our body goes through certain type of oxidative stress in our body, and what happens is that if when we consume, the more food we consume, right, uh, the our cells have to go through higher levels of processing, right, which means that the oxidative stress that the cell would experience is much higher, right? It's like a machine. The more you put in, the more wear and tear it has. Okay, and what happens is that there comes to a point where the cells in your body cannot withstand any more oxidative stress. If not, the cell will die, right? And at that point, it just shuts down and it no longer takes the food inside. So if your carbohydrates cannot go in, right, and what does it do? It just floats in your blood, right? So because
Oh my God.
your body is like saying that this is the best case scenario because you're eating way too much. If not, your cells will just like implode and die because it's putting itself through so much stress. You know, you are just like putting your cell in full throttle, not giving it rest, and obviously you're not burning your energy intake through other forms because you're likely not exercising and all that kind of stuff. So your cells just say, "All right, I'm closing shop," and then everything you're trying to send into the machine will just be stuck outside, and that is usually due to that would usually be the form of sugar, because carbohydrates would either be stored in the liver as liver glycogen or muscle glycogen. And the fact of the matter is that all this storage is actually limited compared to when you can store fat. That's why fat tends to usually be stored. You can actually have like almost an infinite amount of fat, because your fat can be stored around your organs, it can be stored around everywhere, your belly. That's why people can get fatter and fatter, and then their fat gets stored, but because the carbohydrate storage is so limited because of the liver and muscle, that the carbohydrate just like floats in your bloodstream, and that is known as diabetes. So hopefully that makes sense.
Damn. Dude, I store my fat in my head. Is that weird?
I think
moving
that
on.
brain damage. That's usually brain damage.
My head gets bigger, man. I gain
Yeah.
weight, my head gets bigger. It's very awkward. Wish you stored it in like my arms or something. How about let's talk about, because again, when you listen to podcasts and people talk just in generalities, and whether it's sugar spikes and crashes, and that people probably also hear things about seed oils being very bad, as well as processed foods being very bad. But people don't actually necessarily, you just hear these things and you regurgitate. It's processed food. I don't want to eat it. Not necessarily knowing like why is that? Why is it so much worse? A processed chicken, if it's literally a cold cut or whatever, or in seed oils as well. I don't entirely get the seed oils thing.
Yeah. It's interesting as well, because once again, seed oils, also like refined seed oils, goes through that same oxidation process that causes like oxidative stress and free radicals in our body that can cause like cellular damage, right? So I think that the conversation that we have to have is what is the amount that your body can balance, and I think that is very similar to the conversation. Obviously, there's going to be differences. To people say, "Oh, salt is bad for you," right? But the fact of the matter is that if you have too much amount of sodium, right, but you do not have enough potassium, right, there's an electrolyte imbalance, and that usually causes quote unquote high blood pressure, right? So it's more of a balance between sodium and potassium rather than eating salt alone, right? That causes the issue. And I think when it comes to seed oils, it's pretty that conversation can be framed in that manner as well, because you have basically seed oils are really rich in omega-6, right? But most of the food that we consume on a day-to-day basis does not have enough omega-3. So you need a balance of omega-3s to omega-6. That's why people say, okay, cool, you should eat like fatty fish, right? Because omega-3 fatty acids like fatty fish, have a high anti-inflammatory effect. So it does balance things out, right? Whereas people consume highly refined foods like a lot of seed oils, it causes, it basically disproportionately increases the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. Most people don't really consume fish anyway, because one, probably fish is expensive. Second is people might just not be aware, but people tend to consume a lot of this. And that is when the issue arises. Obviously, I'm not discounting the fact that individual might have different reactions towards certain food, certain type of refined oils, that individual allergies or intolerances might actually happen. But the main thing is that seed oils actually cause inflammation, right? And the thing is this as well, inflammation is not only caused by seed oils. When you lift weights, there's inflammation going on, but it's more of like the stacking of this, right? If you have an imbalanced omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, inflammation is higher. If you do eat something else that is problematic, right, inflammation is higher. If you do this, inflammation is higher. So your inflammation just stacks up so high, and that is when the problem comes. And basically, an accumulation of factors that leads to high levels of inflammation is it's the problem, not really that specific thing itself when consumed in low amounts, and especially if you can balance it with omega-3, right? So at least that is based on what the current research has shown. And like I said, even refined carbohydrates tend to lead to slightly higher levels of like quote unquote inflammation. I use that very loosely because people throw inflammation all around. So it's the combination of that. Bad sleeping patterns might also lead to higher inflammation. So you just top that out one on another, right? And then like Jenga, and then you just pull out one, and then your whole body starts breaking down. So that's kind of how I think it's better to look at, rather than saying, oh, this one thing is bad.
Yeah. I mean, I can see sleeping is a whole nother deal. I got sleep apnea, wear a sleep app machine. So sleeping's a whole nother in not only on top of that, I won't derail this. Don't worry, I'll go back to nutrition, but on top of that, falling asleep's an issue or waking up and then staying awake. And that's got nothing to do with sleep apnea. It's just an act of mind, is what it is. What about processed foods? Why do some people get stuck on processed foods are so negative? And I think half the time, I mean, you listen to like mothers talk about it's processed food. I don't make that. I don't eat that. I don't serve that to my kids or whatever. But if you actually ask somebody, why is that processed food bad? What actually makes that processed food so bad? What is exactly we're talking about here? And is processed food too broad a term to use? Like, what does that mean? Processed food could be so different. There's such a variety of ways to that make up processed food that it's just too broad a term to be using in a broad stroke. I'm not sure.
Yeah, like I said, what is processed food, right? What is your degree of process? Because I think that whey protein is processed, right? But whey protein is also one of the most bioavailable, high quality source of protein. When I said, and this is saying protein only because obviously whey protein would lack other micronutrients. Like if you eat red meat, you get iron, for example, right? And you get other minerals. But whey protein, if you want to get protein itself, that's probably the best way you can get it, right? Is fermentation process, you know, yogurt, that's process. Kimchi is fermentation. Is that considered process? So I think the first question we ask ourselves is, what is that process, right? And then we look at, then we ask, why do you think that process might be potentially harmful? And I think that when a lot of people are referring to processed food, they are looking at certain food types that undergo modification that strip away like certain nutrients, like highly refined stuff. Like it just stripped away everything and it's just like essentially like cereal, some of it is just literally sugar with color. So I think that those would be term processed foods. Or for example, like foods with a lot of preservatives, right? Is that processed
Mm.
food, right? How processed is that, right? Is it the same way if you just put everything in a pickle, like pickle juice, where you preserve with salt, or you use artificial preservatives, like when you eat like spam, right? So both undergo some form of preservation, but like, I don't think that process that they undergo is similar. So there are certain elements that goes into it. And like I do say, like the poison is in dose, right? The higher amount of dosage you consume of a certain type of food that contains certain type of ingredients, uh, you know, that is when the issue arises. And then when you stack that on top of other stuff, like you might be eating this, right? You're eating highly refined sugars, you're eating a lot of like preservatives, then you're eating like only like seed oils, right? And all of that, and you stack up, that is when the issue arises. So it is a combination of multitude of factors. And usually on its own, each individual might not cause a problem, but when you compound all of them, then that is when kind of like the issue arises. But I think the way to kind of like just adjudicate what is quote unquote good for you or not when it comes to processed food is ask what is that process that is this food is undergoing, and why is it going? Because processed food was processed to most of the things that was done is to extend the shelf life of something. And then naturally, as you want to extend the shelf life of something for longer, right, there's more preservative that will go into it, and then it comes to the quantity of how much you consume. But then there's also things like, processed versus artificial sweeteners. And the last conversation we talked about, like how people discovered aspartame and all that, right? And all of that, it just really is the dose. But if you're thinking that, I'm only having aspartame from my diet soda, right? That's probably fine. But if you have other ingredients as well, right? Like that contains aspartame that you're unaware of, and you might be consuming large quantity of that, that is where the issue arises, because you're just consuming so much of something and you don't even know that you're consuming it, right? And then you'll be saying,
Mm.
oh, it must be this, right? So that is kind of like, I think, why people look at processed food a certain light, because they don't really know what's in there, right? And then uh, on top of that, they don't really know how much would be the dose that is actually potentially harmful to health.
Let's talk a little bit about cutting for powerlifting and recomp, because obviously, I mean, a lot of the listeners are going to be powerlifters, and we get usual type of questions, but we should probably double back and revisit some of it. So we have a couple protocols. Obviously, calories in, calories out. and you glean this data from these athletes you're working with, find out a baseline for calories. How many steps are you doing? How active are you? And start balancing it out. It's almost like a program, just like a weightlifting program. And it's very much what works for the person. But you're squatting, benching, deadlifting. And in this regard, you got calories in, calories out. And then you have some water manipulation possibly. You have, and some of the questions that arise is sodium manipulation and how prevalent the sodium manipulation is and how important that piece is. Or is it a piece that you shouldn't be tinkering with? And then the day of the recomp. And this is where we've seen some athletes experience extreme cramping on the day of the competition. Everything goes right. The prep is marvelous. The body weight drops because the strength was up due to the resistance training was on point, and the calories in and the calories out with steps on point. So everything went perfect. And then the week of the water loading or taking away of, or both, first loading, then taking away, worked. They made weight perfect. Here we are. And we'll talk a little bit about those steps if you can. And then the day of, though, and we've seen this from back to Michael C. all the way up to my friend Caffrey, who's several times made it to the World Championships representing Canada, and he's dealt with some severe cramps. And I don't know if this is part of if they've done sodium manipulation and electrolyte manipulation, or is there a possibility of too many electrolytes on the day of? My friend Caffrey straight up passed out on the platform. I don't know if you remember on the 83s. Obviously, one of your clients, Jaren's, won, so I'm assuming you remember. But Caffrey full on passed out. And I'm not sure exactly what the heck happened here, but is it a possibility of people having too much electrolytes and that could spike things like heart rate as well as severe cramping? He's experienced severe cramping. It's not just him, though, but even if you don't end up passing out, there is severe cramping that can be involved. And I know this is a common thing. I've heard plenty of people say that they've dealt with these issues. And I think this is a topic that we should maybe touch up on, and if you've seen these kind of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we can kind of like talk about things that we don't know first. I think it's always good to express some form of epistemic humility, or just basically being humble about the things that we know. And currently, cramps are something I always make the joke. I said, like, scientists would be able to tell us, oh yeah, the universe is, probably started from the Big Bang, but we still don't know what causes like cramps. So it's pretty interesting there. And I get this question a lot, and I wish I could provide people with an answer, but the fact of the matter is that I don't. Right? I think that another incident of cramping that was very prominent was, I'm not sure if you remember, but was Bryce Lewis when he was cut down, when he went back to the 93, and he totaled around like 850 at that point, and then he basically cramped up and he only had one deadlift, right? And Bryce Lewis is a big deadlifter, so at that point, he was probably closing in towards, at that time the world record wasn't this high, right? But he was probably closing it towards close to the 880 mark, which is huge, right? Obviously he cramped up, because if you think about it, 850, and if I think Bryce Lewis can, from his opener to his third deadlift, can easily put on 35 kilos, right? So that's like 885, which is insane, at the time. So obviously I have this conversation with Eric, because Eric Helms, my supervisor, who is also at the time when Bryce Lewis was still competing, Bryce's coach, right? And we just talk about cramps. And the fact of the matter is that we don't really know. Let's just look at it from the perspective of what happens during a cramp. So essentially a cramp is when your muscle contracts and it doesn't relax, right? So it just gets stuck in that position. And then there's a lot, there has been a lot of attributing factors towards it in the past. Things like dehydration, right? People say, if you don't consume enough fluids, it can increase the risk of cramps, right? That's one reason. When then we look at electrolyte imbalance, right? When you sweat, you lose electrolytes. It can disrupt muscle function, right? And lead to cramps, right? And things like, your body's not warm enough, right? Then, because if your body is not warm enough, your body tends to shiver, right? So shivering is muscle contracting, and then suddenly it just contracts and your muscle can't relax. So that's another thing. And a whole bunch of stuff. But when we look at the research when it comes to cramping, and I spoke to like top researchers in my university who look at endurance athletes, right? So we have a good group in our lab, and a lot of them, the endurance based research, are like top tier like exercise physiologists, and basically they study like the muscle. And I just asked this guy once, say like, to your knowledge right now, right? What is the current consensus of cramping? And people say we still don't really know. So we don't have an answer, right? And this is for endurance, because obviously powerlifting research or even resistance training research as a whole is very it's in it the infancy stage, right? So not much research is actually done. So we can't even figure out what the consensus is for the mechanisms of cramps in endurance lifters, right? What more in powerlifting research, where the research resources is just so scarce. So the question is that what we the fact of the matter is that we don't really know. But what we can say is that there's potential mechanisms that we could probably have conjecture about, like I said, hydration, right? Electrolyte imbalance. There people actually show that people who have too much sodium and may experience cramp at a higher rate, even though they cannot explain why, right? That is the case. And there's also a chance where people do not experience cramps, even though they don't have adequate electrolytes. But one thing I think that is very important to consider is that when you comes to powerlifting, it's very different from endurance athletes, because endurance athletes you do through repetition, right? Multiple repetitions across a long period of time. Whereas powerlifting, you are succumbing your body to a maximal contraction one to three times. So it could be a combination of factors plus that maximal contraction that causes cramps, right? So I also think that excitatory pathways in your body would play a role. So maybe sometimes if you just overhype yourself way too much, right, your muscles get so excited that it cannot relax, and then you cramp up. That might be another explanation. I used to work with Abdul Mojid from Great Britain. The guy who shamelessly proclaimed he has the genetics of 6 out of 10, which is completely ridiculous. But he is also known for cramping a lot, right? And for him, he can say that it's not the cut, right? Because he is now going into the 120 class, and despite competing at 7 to 8 kilos, almost 7 to 8 kilos heavier, he still experienced cramps. And when I was working with him going into Worlds in Malta last year, I was looking at a lot of other factors as well. I was like, why are you still cramping, right? How's your hydration? And I look at him, and Mo is a very like hype lifter. If you've seen him lift,
Oh
he'll
yeah,
like try to,
dude. In
yeah,
2022, so first off, you're talking about Money Mo, like this is
yeah,
people should know who Money Mo is. But in 2022, he was a madman when he came out for deadlifts. I mean, full on madman. And yeah, he started getting crazy cramping. And then when I was commentating, when I seen him again come out, I'm used to him coming out for deadlifts as a madman. I mean, crazy hyped up like Screamer used to be, and he wasn't. And I was like, get ready, ladies and gentlemen, here he comes. Expect a show. And I asked him afterwards, what's that, man? Why were you hype? Is something going on? What's going on? And he's like, no, I'm trying to stay calm so I don't cramp. I'm trying to not to get too wound up. I'm trying to do a different approach, to your point. And I think he might have still experienced some cramps or whatever. And furthering your point where no dehydration, no, like it can be so many things. It can be dehydration, but it can also not be. It can be something else. It can be electrolytes or lack of or whatever, but it can also not be. So I think to your point, there's a lot of anecdotal for certain people. Check off boxes and try to do this, that, and the other. And if that doesn't reduce the cramps, I'm sorry. I don't have the answer. It could be some of those, though, because I've personally experienced if I'm incredibly dehydrated, I'll start cramping up. And if you watch like the old like UFC and stuff, some guys really do severely cramp up because they get right on death's door. They have 24-hour weigh-ins. However, so yes, you see that and you're like, okay, gotcha. Boom, dehydration, boom, cramp. You see it right there. That's it. Maybe because you could do everything right in terms of water and still cramp, though. It doesn't mean getting dehydrated won't make you cramp. It just means even if you are hydrated, you still might cramp, is all it means. So I know what you're trying to say. And some people might walk away from the conversation not fully grasping that. But yeah, do everything you can. But on the same time, if you're like Mo, I don't know. It's tough,
yeah.
isn't it?
I spoke to Mo as well, and after that, right, I said like obviously at Malfa he didn't do the best, right, and obviously he was disappointed. I mean, I was disappointed at myself because I felt like I didn't help him enough because obviously I don't promise people I say I'm gonna solve your cramps, especially with something that I don't really have the answer. I said we'll do our best, but I just started thinking about like possible scenarios, and then I just said like what occurred to me is like, bro, like he came out for his first attempt of bench press. He's the lift that he's the weakest at, all right, and he started getting hype and he cramped his forearms. I'm like, do you really need to get hype for your first bench press attempt? So I just spoke to him, right? And I said, like, maybe you can try this. I'm not saying it will work. But the fact of the matter is that we know that cramping is a thing that happens with some form of signaling because your brain has to signal for your muscle to contract, right? And then your brain is not signaling for your muscle to relax. Or what is causing that, we don't really know. I also tend to notice people who are slightly more nervous lifters, at least the ones that I work with, tend to experience higher levels of cramps. So there's a whole bunch of factors that can potentially impact it. And the fact of the matter that is that we don't really know the answer. But like you said, we check off the boxes, we make sure that we don't leave any stone unturned. And then I wouldn't say hope for the best, but that's the best we can do based on what we know right now. And sometimes that's just the nature of the sport.
So leading in, I mean, I was saying let's walk through all this, but we kind of got stuck on the recomp there because it was an interesting one we hadn't previously hit. And we see some high level people at the world championships experience cramping and different things popping up. And this has been a bit of a conversation. So I want to touch base on that. But even leading into, so we know calories in, calories out when you're way far out is the name of the game. Relatively gotcha. Pretty easy peasy, I guess. I mean, you want to do it properly, but we all understand that. We've dove into that. The week of, how much is it water loading? How much sodium manipulation do you like to do? And then cutting off the water. What
Yeah.
does that all look
So
like?
I guess based on the current research, right? So that this is a big chunk of my PhD thesis is trying to find out normative ranges. What I mean by normative ranges, it just means what is the normal range someone can lose while performing a specific method of weight cutting. Currently, if we look at the research out there, when we look at some form of gut manipulation by itself, right? There was one study that actually showed roughly 0.8% to 1% of body weight that was lost, right? And then I tweaked the protocol slightly, and then I think the highest group the highest person in my group lost around 1.6%, so almost a double from the previous study. So we can probably say that the range for someone who can lose more, and this is very individual because obviously if you're eating a lot of vegetables and high fiber and complex carbohydrates, you will likely lose more on when you manipulate food volume and gut volume, right? So it's very individual, but I would say that the range from that would be 0.8% to 1.6% would be a safe range to bet on. The thing with water loading research is just that we don't really know much because the only study that was done when it comes to water loading is that the group lost around approximately 3% right, but they also the authors that wrote the paper actually said that they would also manipulate like the food composition as well. So there is some discrepancy, not discrepancy, but there's the data is slightly more convoluted with two methods being used at once. But if we take the study that I did and the study that the other group did in terms of manipulating fiber or food or gut volume, right, and we subtract that from the water loading paper, we can say that people would roughly lose around probably around the 1.8 to maybe the low 2% range from a water manipulation protocol. So that's roughly what you would do. Although there's something that I'm genuinely curious about is to look at whether if you stack out methods, will there be an sort of like an additive effect, or whether there's a rate of diminishing returns, meaning that when you stack up, that it just stacks up proportionally. So if you lose 0.8% here, right, and 2.5%, then the total you get is 3.3%. Or because you already hit certain thresholds, when you start stacking things up, there's a rate of diminishing returns. So maybe instead of losing 3.3, you only lose 3%, right? So I don't really know what the answer would be for that. That's still something I'm pondering about. But at the end of the day, I don't think that I think that every good coach would do, especially when you're going into a meet that's high stakes, is to try the testing protocol and see if it works or not, and how much you can lose, instead of going in blind, right? So I think that is what every good nutrition coach that has expertise in rapid weight cutting would perform. So that's kind of like the normative ranges that I can currently provide to the listeners out there. However, when it comes to the question of sodium manipulation, I think that every water loading protocol would manipulate sodium to a certain extent. What I mean by a certain extent is that we know for a fact is that sodium consumption actually retains fluids. So if you are water loading, you should probably cut out sodium as you approach midday, right? So that is the minimum, the bare minimum that someone should do when they are manipulating their water. However, there are certain lifters out there as well that would actually be increasing their sodium intake to quote unquote sodium load. So I'm not sure if you actually remember our good old mate Ricky Cho. The first podcast that I was on was with
Oh
Ricky, and
yeah.
yeah, you, Ricky, and myself, where my mic was an absolute potato mic where he basically couldn't hear anything. And Ricky, that the thing that you brought us on was to discuss the rapid weight cutting and how Ricky cut from 80. But what the weight that Ricky was on was also he was actually sodium loading at that time. So naturally, when he consumed high amounts of fluid, his body would be retaining a lot more fluids, right? And then obviously he would cut his sodium out in the end. I don't know for a fact if that a sodium loading followed by a sodium cut would actually result in a higher amount of fluid loss compared to if you just cut out sodium at the closer towards the competition. And the reason why I say I don't know is because, first of all, the mechanisms of water loading is also still relatively unclear. Like I said, there's only one study that actually looked into it. Because to look at it in detail to understand the mechanisms behind it is actually quite difficult. You have to look at certain hormones like ADH, right? Looking at things. So you actually have to collect the data for hormones and you have to send it for analysis. It's just not looking at the outcome. And a lot of this costs a lot of money, right? So people wouldn't usually spend a lot of money for this. So that's one, we don't know that. And the second reason is that electrolyte balance is really tightly regulated in our body, right? So like I said, it's because it is a fundamental process. It's not something that is attributed towards resistance training, right? Like for example, increased muscle mass is something that's attributed towards resistance training, but electrolyte balance in our body is fundamental for health and survival. So it's very, very tightly regulated to the point that I don't know if artificial consumption of sodium, at least from food, can actually cause anything that would disrupt that electrolyte imbalance in our body. So with that two factors that I mentioned, I would probably say that it doesn't really. I would, if I were to bet, right, gun to my head, I would say that increasing your sodium intake and then cutting it out probably would not lead to any significant difference compared to if you were to just cut out your sodium. However, there's one case that I would probably look at increasing sodium intake, and that is when someone who most likely, sorry to all my British friends out there, but most likely to all my British friends that don't eat salt in their food, right? They don't use salt in their food. If they are
Don't
water loading, sorry.
don't put salt in the food.
I mean, we
Oh my god.
the joke is that like British food is really bland, so there's like
Yeah.
we always say that how they like they used to colonize India and take all their spices, but they never use any in their food, and they don't use salt. That's why their food is like so bland. So I would say that if you don't really salt your food, right, and because you're water loading, you're artificially increasing that fluid, right? So the balance of electrolyte in your body is also due to the amount of fluid you're consuming, because the amount of fluids that you're consuming would dilute the electrolytes in your blood, right? So if you don't usually salt your food and you're water loading, if you're consuming high amounts of fluid, you may actually feel like a little bit like dizzy sometimes. So in that case, I would say, just increase the salt intake in your food just to make sure you don't pass out when you're drinking high amounts of fluid. But the purpose of that is for more like a health and well-being perspective rather than manipulating the outcome of losing more weight. So that's the only time I would increase sodium intake is for someone who do not typically have sodium in their diet and they are now increasing their fluid intake by a lot. So yeah.
About that recomp on the recomp day when you have 2 hours, you just weighed in. You got 2 hours. and then lifting begins. What are some of the things that people really, and this is, let's say it's a tough guy. What are some of the things that people have dropped the ball on that you're like, listen to me. If you're listening to this right now, please pack this in your bag if you're going to be recomping, and here's how you got to do it.
Yeah, I think that two perspectives. I mean, not two perspectives, but two elements would be very important. The first element would be hydration, right? And this is based on the assumption that you are, like you said, you are cutting quite a bit and you only have 2 hours, meaning that you will go through dehydration either through some form of fluid manipulation, like a water load and a water cut, or you induce dehydration through sweating, right? So any form of dehydration, then you should really prioritize hydration. Not to mention, for most people as well, they would undergo slightly a slight dehydration, just because even if they are not consuming any form of they're not performing any form of protocols that dehydrate them specifically, they would still be fasting for an extended period of time. So instead of like, hey, in the morning when I wake up, I slept for 8 hours, I wake up and drink a glass of water and have my coffee. Now I have to wait for like 14 hours from the last time I drank my fluids, right? So you still go through some form of dehydration. So hydration would always be the most important factor that we would really, really want to consider, right? And I think that is number one thing, is how can we get as much fluids into your body as quickly as we can, right? So there are multiple factors that can actually impact that, right? Obviously, if you want to look into more specific on how I would do the cut, right? I think the resource that combines everything would be Matt Gary's game day book, which I wrote as chapter 4 in terms of cutting, right? You can purchase that and then look at it, right? There's like some of the podcasts I did, actually yesterday I just did this same topic for Powell, which is Agatha's coach. So I did sort of like a rehydration workshop for the Polish population, which is very interesting
Wow,
because
no kidding.
Agatha translated it, and I think she did a great job. So it was fun.
Hmm.
Yeah, but what we did was, the most important thing is hydration, and there are certain factors that impact it, and very, very, very briefly, right? And not to go too much into the weeds, because like their presentation was like 1.5 hours, so I don't think
Let's
we
do
want a
it.
5 hour.
Starting right now, let's make this a 5-hour podcast.
Yeah,
Start from the top, please. If you don't mind,
yeah, it's like,
pull up your slides. I had and here's a surprise guest. We have Agata Shiko.
yeah, it's like we try to beat
Translating Polish, actually. No, sorry. Okay, go.
yeah. So you try to beat Lex Friedman for the longest podcast ever. But yeah,
That's
I
right.
think that we fluid intake would matter, right? So the amount of fluid that you need to consume would be very, very important, right? When we look at higher rates of basically gastric emptying, which is the rate where your stomach empties the water, right? Higher amounts of fluids tend to have higher rates of gastric emptying. So we probably want that. We also don't want it to be too calorically dense. Just from the think of it, the perspective is that if you have too many calories in a single consumption, your body needs time to digest, and that would impact the amount of time that your body would allow the fluids to go into your bloodstream, because you first have to go through your stomach, and then it goes through your intestines, and throughout your intestines, it then goes through your bloodstream, right? So if there's some lag in the stomach, you'll be slower, right, down the line. So you don't want to consume things that are too high in calories right at the start. And obviously, hydration is not only the process that of how much water you can get in, but how much water you can retain, right? So then that's when the factor of sodium comes into play, because sodium, like as I mentioned, retains fluids. And what you want to do is that you want to make sure that there's enough sodium in the fluids. And for most people, I'm just giving a broad recommendation, because the demands will be very different from people, especially if someone sweats or not. Because when people sweat, they tend to lose more sodium, especially some people who are sweaty sweaters. They tend to lose more sodium than others, so they need more sodium. But in general, 1 gram of sodium per liter of fluid, right, is the just broad recommendation for what I would just start with for most people. And that is probably like the three components of hydration, I would say. Then people ask me, oh, what about potassium? So the thing with potassium is that it's a little bit tricky, just because for most people, if you eat a well-balanced diet that has enough potassium, you usually get potassium from bananas, potatoes, spinach, things like that. You should be fine with potassium. And obviously, you lose potassium when you sweat, right? If you're not sweating, you probably would not lose potassium as well. So you don't really need high amounts of potassium when it comes to hydration, because potassium actually does not play a role in terms of retaining fluids, but it plays a role in balancing, right? The balance, right? So at least when the fluids is inside your body, then it plays a role. But prior to that, it doesn't. So you don't really need as much potassium compared to sodium, right? So yeah, that's kind of like all. I would say the biggest mistake people would make is they start eating before drinking, because like I said, hydration can be impacted by the amount of calories, and you're likely to consume more calories if you eat a whole bunch of food rather than drinking them. Also, because in the span of a 2-hour weigh-in, you're probably not going to be digesting your food so quickly that you're able to utilize so many calories for energy. And the fact of the matter is that you probably don't need it, right? Your glycogen levels will probably not be depleted enough that you need massive and quick replenishment of your glycogen. So you don't actually need that many carbohydrates to begin with. You definitely don't need protein because protein doesn't provide any ergogenic impact. Ergogenic just simply means performance enhancement. So you don't need protein, right? So hydration plays the number one role. And then once you get that settled, you can start having some food to fill your stomach, right? Because you don't want to feel too hungry, right? Hunger levels actually does impact like perceived RPE, right? So if you're hungry, you may, with the same load that has been given to you, you may actually feel like it's much harder compared to if you were not, right? So you just want to eat enough to you're full. You also don't want to stuff yourself because you don't want to be throwing up on the platform because your belt is like compressing your stomach and you have so much food in your stomach and everything just like throws out, you know. So those are the things that I would say is important. But to answer the question of what you should have in your bag, I would probably say that you should have enough fluids and probably some form of like sports drink powder. I like it in powder form because you can proportion the amount of powder you want per liter of fluid. But whereas if you buy a ready-made in a bottle, you cannot actually control that, right? So a sports drink powder would actually if those are the two things that I would have in the bag.
One thing I want to ask you about, and we kind of skirted past it, but and this is kind of off the topic of nutrition, but on your strength and conditioning coaching, because you're right, you came this close to Emil winning a world title, and you've had plenty of success on the nutrition side coaching, but you coach writing programs for people in terms of their strength and conditioning for powerlifting. And Emil came super duper close within one deadlift, but he's going to be at Sheffield. Um, and just maybe speaking on that and working with Emil and how has Emil been doing and seeing your athlete come that close. I know it's bittersweet because another one of your athletes ended up winning. And it's
Yeah.
great again. It's great to have like your resume in terms of nutrition is insane at this point. And with Kjell with you and what it looks like the progress you guys have been making together, it's only going to be legendary, right? If it's not already legendary within the community. And thank you for coming on the podcast, my dear friend. You didn't get too big to forget about your boy Six and keep coming on the podcast. But maybe after Kjell wins, you're like, all right, I'll talk to my agent. But in terms of taking on Emil and some of your strength athletes and how that has been, and Emil choosing you and saying, I want you to take over my coaching. And obviously, things have gone well because Emil has been a stud and is forever in the hunt for that world title.
Yeah, I think that's interesting as well, right? Like I said, I didn't really have many high level lifters, right? I of course have. I think that the most I've done, uh, obviously the highest level lifters that I've coached would probably be Heather Connor. Obviously now would the Emil Krastev, and obviously there's also Kyoda. So those are the three, right? But other than that, I mean, like a lot of the other coaches, for example, like Joey has like multiple world champions, right? TSG has Taylor and Leah, you know, and Marcellus, you know, has another whole shebang, right? Like basically half of like at that point, like half of powerlifting America is probably coached by Marcellus or something, you know. But for me, I think working with Emil, right, it was a very like interesting process because naturally, one, if you ever spoke to Emil, he's a very reserved person, right? So he doesn't really speak much. Second is that his English has gotten better over the years, but his command of English wasn't even the best. And I place a huge emphasis on communication, and not to mention cultural factors as well. Like Emil is an Eastern European, and Eastern European culture is very different from American, where you know we emphasize like a collaborative approach in coaching, right? whereas Emil's from Bulgaria, you know, and they have the famous Bulgarian weightlifting thing where they just put them like on a crazy weightlifting protocol, and if you survive, you survive and you become a world champion, but if not, you just die and break every bone in your body, you know. So like that's kind of like the culture underlying like certain Eastern European sports. At the time, it was a little bit hard for us to just kick things to kickstart the process, right? But I think in due time, right, both of us putting in effort, right, me trying to understand him better, even up to today, sometimes when I ask him, how's your training? He'll just like send me the training video. I said like, how's your training? Not send me your training videos, because I can watch your training videos like at the end of the week, but it doesn't really tell me how you felt about your training session, right? So sometimes there's still that, but it does show you that cultural thing, right? It's like, oh, I think my coaches want to see what I'm doing, but I want to know how you feel about your session, which is something that
Like,
most people don't really talk about.
He's you want me to talk about my feelings? He's what are you doing here? What are we doing here?
Yeah.
You're like, no, just let me know what's going on. Listen, what not to interrupt you, sorry, but I met Emil in 2021 Worlds, and um he was super friendly, and he was like hanging out, and he wanted to be a part of it, the experience. We're all in the lobby. Look, I talk about Worlds lobbies, and it's amazing, but it's true. And he was hanging on the lobby, he wanted to be experienced, but his English was it's come so far. And at the time, he was a little sketchy on his English, but his girl was there. And she was help translating and keeping him in the flow, which I really appreciate. She was doing that for him. And he was a part of it. He was hanging out. And then 3 years later, he can talk in English now. And I don't know how as good as English was before, maybe his confidence level. Usually, people, there's a bit of a jump where, no, you're ready. You're just not confident enough. Turbo Tiff, same. Turbo Tiff now is doing interviews in English. And there was a moment there where she was, I don't speak English. Her English has gone a lot better. But anyways, yeah, in Emil, now Emil's hanging out. When we go all meet at Silent Worker, he's in the bunch. We had a podcast with the 93s right after Worlds live, and Emil was one of them. Now, having said that, right before we went live and we got the 93s with us, Emil goes, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm more afraid and scared right now than I was before the competition. Like, really? He
That's
goes, oh, yeah,
that's literally what he
petrified.
told me. He said, I'm more afraid of the interview than actually lifting.
And that's such an Eastern European thing, whereas like a lot of the, Westerners would be like, yeah, let's sling them from the hip. This is going to be fun. This is, it's just different. It's just different. But he's such a freaking nice guy. Like he's so
Yeah.
like it's a cultural thing to your point about like if he's not going to say something or whatever, it's a cultural thing, but he's nice and he'll be around and he's, it's just whatever. It's just
Yeah.
different.
I think that tells a lot as well about like knowing this person and as a person, and that plays a role in our coaching as well, because to know this person, you know what motivates them, you know their background, right?
Mhm.
And I think that working with Emil, that I think I don't know how much people know about the story that uh that he had, right? Obviously, the reason why he switched over was after he bombed at Euros, right? Because also he was suffering from an injury after South Africa, right? Suffering through an injury, right? And basically came to me. I'm like, okay, cool. At that time, it's also really interesting because when we started working together, we actually didn't know he got a Sheffield invite. That's because the Bulgarian Federation didn't send him the email, and it was actually like way past the deadline already. So when we already started working together for 3 weeks, and then he said that, oh, I found I had the Sheffield invite and I should have replied them like 2 weeks ago. So I asked him to immediately message Pete Spence, and like, yeah, thank God at that point they haven't found a replacement yet. So Emil, despite being injured, still managed to go to
Nice.
Sheffield. But for me, it was like, first of all, we can't really communicate in the same language. Second is that you're injured, so it's probably harder to navigate training. And third, our first competition together would be the first ever Sheffield. Great, like no pressure, Kedric, Uh,
Yeah.
so that was all like really really interesting, right? And then I think that I think people looking at the whole process, people will say, oh, it's very easy for people out there to say, okay, Kedric will work with Emil because Emil is one of this like highest, like one of the top 93 lifters in the world, and that is 100%, he's that is true about him. But I think really want what made me really want to help him when he told me about his situation, and he said that there were times in the gym, right, where when I was injured, there'll be days where I only can go into the gym and I'll squat 70 kilos and I'll leave because that's all I can do. Sometimes if it's just the bar, I'll do the bar and I'll leave. And that speaks to me more about that person rather than this person being able to stand on the podium and medal and win and be a world champion, because that tells me about the person much more, right? And I know
Was
what motivates the person.
Emil was saying that, like, if I got to squat 70 kilos, he'll go in and he'll train with 70 kilos and leave.
Yep, they said that's all I can do for the day. I'll just squat with 70 kilos and I'll just bench and then I'll leave because that's all I can put on my back on that day, you know. So that like stuck with me a lot, right? And that made me really wanted to help him, right? And that also tells you something about a person, right? It tells you that some people can just really easily brush off injuries, but if you go through an injury to the point where sometimes you can only squat 70 kilos on the bar, right? You probably don't want to put the person, let's just say if I have a choice, right? If I need to roll the dice, right? And if I push this lifter for another week and not deload this person, or maybe this take back, ask this lifter to chill, this person may increase the chance of injury risk versus someone who is like, yeah, injuries, I'm cool with it. But for Emil, I know that this is how he perceive a situation like that because of his past experience. I probably don't want to roll the dice towards that direction. I'm not going to take my chances because 1 week of extra gains might not be worth it if you get injured and it affects him mentally, you know, because that mental effect can actually last longer than that week, right? So I think that knowing the lifter, that is very, very important. But what I know is that he would do whatever it takes for him to get better, because like the guy squats 300 kilos. 70 kilos is like not even like, you know, it's like freaking 25% of 1 rep max. Can you imagine
He
going
arm
to the
curls
gym?
it.
Yeah. Training 25% of my 1 rep max. I would say like I'm not gonna go to the gym to only do 25% of my 1 rep max. But that tells me something about that person. And that made me want to help him even more. So naturally we had to figure out the process that works for him. And I think that Wolves was really, really good, right? Getting to see him back on the stage. And obviously Gustav winning. You know, I don't want to claim too much. I know Gustav would tell people the truth of our work, our relationship, and how much I help him. But we cannot deny the fact that Gustav won on body weight, right? And as the nutrition guy, you know, maybe I played a small role about that.
You know what? Well,
You know,
you're like, it's got to be said. It's got to be said. One on body weight. One on body weight. I was his nutrition coach. That's true.
yeah, I mean, like those are the things I think about, right? Because Gustav, even in the podcast with yourself, even in Sheffield, he said I managed to eat going into competition, right? And therefore I felt strong, right? Obviously, the prep for Gustav going to Worlds wasn't the best because of him competing at nationals. Even though I told him that you should just go in and just sandbag nationals, but he didn't. You know, and things like that. But he still managed to eat going into competition, right? And I'm not saying that it would make or break his performance, because I don't doubt that Gustav is a fantastic lifter, super strong, years of experience. Emil will tell you the same thing, right? He has earned, you know, he's earned the stripes. He has earned the achievements. That yeah, he definitely has earned it, right? And I think that winning Sheffield and then Worlds probably puts him in contention for the best male lifter of 2024.
I think so.
And he has 100% earned it, right? And but I think that he would tell you that the ability to eat going into competition has helped him a fair bit. So it was nice to see Gustav win. Obviously, it makes it a little bit more bittersweet when you know that they literally totaled the same and one person had a lower body weight. And you know, Emil was basically like victory just literally slipped out from his fingers, right? And the thing was that it wasn't even hard, right?
Literally,
like none of his
dog.
yeah.
I don't know if you meant to be poetic when you said that, but that deadlift literally just came out of his fingers.
Yeah.
He had it.
Yeah. I mean, I listened to your commentary after the second attempt. You will be like, you know, it looks like he's running away with it because the second attempt moved like an opener, you know?
Yeah.
So things like this, right? And the fact of the matter is that I think that looking at Emil and the amount of setbacks, I mean, all this until you reach the pinnacle, right? Everything that you face would seem like a setback. And despite the setbacks that he has gone through, especially with the injuries, right? You know, he still is continually pursuing and pushing the boundaries of what he can achieve, right? And I think that that's admirable. I think that that is something that makes me want to help him, regardless of whatever accolades that he will achieve in the future. You know, obviously we will keep doing our best. We will go to Sheffield. You know, we will go to Worlds again. You know, I do hope that our coaching relationship would extend to at least one of us retire, whoever retires first. You know, and honestly, I think that Emil will also be really, really good as a 105 kilo lifter. So we'll see, right? Maybe when he decides that, oh, I've done this as a 93, I'll move up to 105. Then that gives me another, like the second win. It's like how Kjell going down to 66. Now you have Emil at 105. That makes me like it's also another exciting thought to think about in the future. So
You've done phenomenal with Emil. He's definitely stronger. He's definitely a better lifter. There's no question. And he looked fantastic at Worlds. Him going to a 105. The big thing is that's a 13 kilo gap. The jump between 93 to 105 is just so crazy. Like in terms of body weight that they're expecting an athlete to make, that jump is ridiculous.
Yeah,
it's a massive jump in body weight. 12 kilos. Sorry, I said 13, but that's like, what is that? 25 pounds or whatever or more? It's nuts.
yep.
I mean, he's got a good nutrition coach that available that can help him, but it's still pretty crazy. Like how much could he put on that much muscle? Is he going to have to put on body fat as well? Emil's diced up. Yeah, that's a big decision to be like, all right, well, what are we talking about here? Am I going to get a little chubby or what are we doing? We'll have to see, right?
Yeah, I think lifestyle choices, like I say, I'm close to Emil, and outside of coaching, we are friends as well. And I think he would probably say that I help him with his own coaching. And he does see me as a friend and to an extent a mentor of certain kind. And we talk about family sometimes as well. And he did say that he wants children in the future, and maybe when he has kids, he can't sustain 93, and he just has to go to 105. That's how like Taylor Edward needs to go as 83 when he has children. I'm not completely discounting that, right? But there will be a point where sometimes if you want to continue to extend your career in powerlifting, that is something that you have to do. And the thing that you also have to remember is, obviously Gavin didn't compete at Worlds this year, right? But Emil, among the top 4 finishers of Worlds, between Gustav, Petri, Emil, and Carlos, Emil is the youngest lifter on the top 4. So he still has
right?
Yeah, he still has years to go.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not by a lot, right? But I mean, if you add Kaiko is also relatively, like, he's like 30s, right? So
Yeah, early 30. He's 33,
yeah,
34.
yeah. So Emil has still years to go, and I don't know what that would look like for him in the future. But I don't want to discount that, for him. At the end of the day, we just, like I said, I hope that we continue working with each other until either one of us chooses to retire, me from coaching or him from the sport. And I don't want to. I want the I want us to be able to think about, like, okay, cool, there's still a potential, after you've done 93, there's still 105 that you can potentially go to, even though you don't have to fill up the 105 class. You can just be 98
That's
kilos
true.
for a while, and
That's true.
yeah. So it'll be interesting to see. And I think that the most important thing right now is the prep all the way to Sheffield. I know he was really, really happy when he got the got the spot, right? I wasn't really sure how that would play out, because naturally Anatoly actually totaled 0.5 more than the world record, right? Because the world record was 940, and then Anatoly did 940.5, but Emil did 895, which is exactly the world record. So he didn't break the world record. So I didn't know how that would play out. But he got the spot, and I think that it's nice to see him. It's nice to see that his hard work paid off, right? And I think that is, as a coach, that is the biggest thing that makes me happy, is that showing the athlete getting what they have worked so hard for. And I think that Emil doesn't get as much attention most of the time, is also because he doesn't really speak English as much, so it's harder for people to relate. But people are kind of like noticing him a little bit more now, and fingers crossed, right? Because I think that if you want to make powerlifting a career, you need eyes on you, right? So like, hopefully that opens up avenues for him to actually take powerlifting a little bit more seriously, because like, the less you have to work, like how Gustav in the podcast says that my work is really good because they are really understanding. If I have to leave early because I have to go train on this day, I'll just tell them I have to leave early, so Gustav can do that, right? And I know Gustav's lifestyle like the back of my hand because being his nutrition coach, that's kind of like how I cater towards the demands that he needs. But I think that with more opportunities opening up for powerlifters, for Emil, he can also work less, and with more time with less time spent working, he can spend on other aspects that could potentially improve his career as a powerlifter. So yeah, that's kind of like things that I'm excited for him.
Yeah, Emil, think the more and more, obviously, he gets more comfortable with English and gets more comfortable in podcasts, the more it's going to open up avenues for his own coaching, the more he's going to be able to be more focused on powerlifting and things will open up like that. Look, the guy's been at the top, and it's been years now. 2021 Worlds I described. Am I crazy in saying he won a bronze medal? Did he win bronze in
2020,
2021?
no, he got silver.
Did he get silver in 2021? Let me pull
Wait,
this up right
was
now.
2021? No, 2021 was
Hold on a sec. Let's
was
fact
that in
check
Sweden?
ourselves. That's in Sweden. Kind love. Let's
I don't think he competed there. There's COVID woes, right?
no, he's at COVID Worlds. 2021, he got bronze. Okay, man. See, come on, man. I'm king of the list. Come on, man.
Yeah,
I was caught.
props.
So, European Classic in 2019, he got a bronze. That one slipped by me. 2021 Worlds, he got a bronze. 2022 Worlds, he got a silver. Sheffield World Championships 2023 bronze, and then Worlds right here silver. I mean, the guy's been grabbing at European and World Championships. The guy's resume stacked. He's been getting bronze and he's been podiuming, not winning it though. And we've seen Gustav for years in that position and then pulls it off and wins. In a lot of ways, Gustav is like an inspiration for Emil. Where it's like, look, he did it. You could do it the same as well. You guys are kind of you know you're world class, and he's getting closer and closer and closer. Emil's right on that edge, man. He's ready to break over. He's actually a guy. I think I'd like to have him on the podcast in this setting. He'll be at home. He'll be even more comfortable. We'll see. And I'm pretty sure he lives with his girl, and if he ever gets stuck on something, she could help him. But I think his English, I don't even think he needs a translator, to tell you the truth. Not anymore. I
Yeah,
think he's 100. I think he's good.
yeah,
I think he's good to
yeah.
go.
Yeah, and I think Emil would say that as well, right? Like he said that Gustav has been an inspiration for him because you just see the amount of work that Gustav put in day in, day out, day in, day out, and finally he's there, you know. I think that gives hope for a lot of people, right? And Emil is one of them. I think Gustav in the podcast mentioned as well that, you know, they talk about training, you know, or you know, they share their stuff with one another. And you know, they are rivals on the platform, but you know, outside, you know, they're like friends, which is great for me, you know, helping both of them, right? And I'm friends with both of them as well outside of training. So I think it'd be interesting to see how the next couple of big competitions where they go head to head will play out, you know, and obviously with the 93s from the US being stacked as well, and obviously not discounting the progress that Carlos is making, and hopefully he can make progress on his travels, you know. Uh, and you know, I think
Exactly.
yeah,
I'm so glad Carlos is in the mix, though. He's such a spicy contender.
yeah, he is like a lot of the 93s are very like soft, like spoken, you know, like Emil, you know, even you know P3. I mean, P3 has some spicy moments, you know, especially when he
Oh,
talks about Russ.
he
Yeah,
gets spicy.
yeah,
You
but
bring up
only
the
but
right topic or the right person,
yeah,
plural sins, he'll get spicy with
yeah,
you.
but he doesn't. It's not spicy within the 93s competition between themselves. You know, Gustav is relatively you know down to earth as well. Kaiko is also very very similar. So Carlos like adds the element of spice on top for all of them. You know, he like compensates for all of them all together. So
Dude,
it's fun to
he
watch.
jumped in and embraced the role of the machismo bad guy who will be like, he can call people out and be like, I'm here, elbow his way into the front, and he's lived up too. Like when he got that Sheffield invite through a regional invite, a lot of people like, gosh, I mean, it is what it is. It's part of the rules as a regional invite, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're amongst the elite. You're just there to represent your region on the stage. And then Carlos took that opportunity and said, "Oh no, I'm amongst the elite," and put on a hell of a show. And now he's at the World Championships, breaking records with a crazy backstory of his late arrival, and he's like an amazing on the podcast, and I don't know. He adds a whole nother ingredient, my friend. I'm glad he's here.
Yeah, I also find it really like fun that he refers people by their last name. You know, he calls Gustav, Petrie, and Hedlund. He never like calls them by their first name. So
Carlos does? Really?
yeah, you could listen back to the White Lies podcast. He don't he refers to people by their last name, not the first name.
I don't know if I noticed that.
Yeah,
Hmm.
you can just go back and listen. He calls Gustav Hedlund. He doesn't call Gustav, he call Hedlund. So it's
Nobody
actually
calls
quite
Gustav Hedlund. People call, so we do the last name. The last name thing's not too crazy. People call me Lapadat or whatever, but I've never in my life heard someone refer to Gustav as Hedlund.
yep, neither.
I've never. That sounds weird to me. People
Yep.
say last names. Atwood. Where's Atwood at?
Yeah. Yeah,
But
like
or
Petrie as
Taylor.
well.
Petrie more so. Petrie
Yep.
actually said coming up, everyone just referred to him as Petrie. They didn't call him
Yep.
Brandon. And
Yep.
he's actually said it sounds weird to be called Brendan. He prefers Petrie. It's so, but Petrie's like a unique last name as well, so you know exactly who they're talking about. You can't do it for
Yep.
like Smith. Where's
Yep.
Smith at? Well, I mean, who the fuck are you talking about? Like, or
Yeah.
whatever. Too common of a name. Petrie stands out. But Hedlund, I ain't never heard nobody refer to Gustav as Hedlund.
Yeah.
That's
You can't use you definitely can't call some people by their last name. Imagine you call somebody like in Korea Lee, that's like calling like half of Korea. Like Lee Kim
exactly.
or
You gotta
Park,
be
you
more
know?
specific, man. Yeah,
Yeah.
you can't be running down the street thinking you're gonna get the right guy's attention. Um, but yeah, no, it's this Sheffield, the clash between Gustav and Emil is gonna be phenomenal to see. And they're so closely stacked. I mean, you flip a coin. And the one thing I did like too about that podcast that I just dropped with Gustav, my man actually like Gustav, I know he's not Eastern European, but he's pretty stoic the way he carries himself, pretty keeps himself. He broke down and got emotional a little bit. Eyes teared up a little bit. I took that clip and I had to freaking clip it and throw it out there on the internet because I'm like, holy shit, Gustav dropped his guard and got emotional. His eyes got watery. And I was like, oh, wow. And it was when he was talking about years chasing and never winning. And he's like, this is the first year that I'm really proud about what I did. And he heard himself say that. He's like, holy shit. And he got emotional. I mean, of course, the guy won Sheffield and then he won the world championship. I mean, that's a hell of a back to back. How do you beat that? I put the poll up there. Is Gustav 2024 powerlifter of the year on the men's side, or is this too early to call? The poll was no, he is. I mean, he won. They were like, yes, it's Gustav. I'll put it again at the end of the year just in case. But yeah, I mean, what do you say, man? The guy's pathway has been legendary. But yeah,
Yeah.
let's have some more clashes. Like Pete Sampras and Andre Agassi in their prime clashed 2 dozen times. That could be Emil and Gustav, all the 93s. But everyone's going to be excited to see these guys clash again at Sheffield. And it's
Yeah.
going to be flip a
I
coin.
agree.
Come down to the
Well,
very last deadlift every single time. They're so close.
yep.
It'll be good. And he was, listen, man, we're past 3 hours, huh? We're getting close to
Yeah.
3.5 if we don't put a stop to this. Holy shit. When we were talking in the DMs, you're like, this is going to be a 3 hour one. And I'm like, nah, I don't know. We'll see. And it's like, yeah, we're three, we're over 3 hours. It is what it is, man. I appreciate you coming on the podcast. Obviously, we're going to do this again. We'll let some time pass and observe some things will pop up and we'll do it all over again. I'll see you at Sheffield and freaking we'll take it from there, buddy. Stay in
Yep.
contact.
100%. Thank you for having me. And yeah, uh, we'll definitely be in touch.
Door is always open, my friend. And for everybody listening, as per usual, please do subscribe, give us high ratings, and until next time, six pack Lapadat, 6 up, and we are out.